Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we're diving deep into something that's going to completely shatter every romanticized notion you've ever had about ancient Egypt. We're talking about the disturbing life of pharaohs in ancient Egypt. And before you roll your eyes, thinking this is just another pharaohs were cool video, let me stop you right there. Forget everything Hollywood told you. Forget the glamorous golden masks and the majestic pyramids. We're about to peel back 4,000 years of propaganda and tourist brochures to reveal what life was really like when you were literally considered a living god. Spoiler alert, you probably wouldn't last a week. So before we dive into this rabbit hole of ancient madness, do me a favor and hit that like button if you enjoy these kinds of deep dives into history's darkest corners. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'm genuinely curious if anyone's brave enough to watch this from Egypt itself. Now dim the lights, maybe grab a snack, though you might lose your appetite. And let's jump into the most psychologically twisted job description in human history: being a pharaoh. Picture this: you wake up one morning, and congratulations, you're now a god. Not metaphorically, not spiritually, literally. Every single person in your kingdom of millions believes you control the sun, the Nile, life, death, and whether their crops grow this year. No pressure, right? But here's the kicker, and this is where it gets really disturbing. You didn't choose this job. You were probably around 10 years old when it happened, maybe younger. One day you're a kid playing with wooden toys. The next you're responsible for maintaining the cosmic order of the universe. Welcome to the most successful scam in human history, and you're both the perpetrator and the victim. Let me paint you a picture of your typical morning as pharaoh. It's 3000 BCE. Somewhere along the Nile, and the sun is just starting to peek over the horizon. But you can't just wake up like a normal person. Oh no. See, the Egyptians believed that every morning, you, the pharaoh, had to help the sun god Ra win his daily battle against the forces of chaos and darkness. So while you're still groggy and probably need to pee, your priests are already chanting, performing rituals, and basically counting on you to make sure the sun actually rises today. Because if it doesn't, well, that's on you, God boy. The pressure starts the moment you open your eyes, and it never, ever stops. Your first thought isn't what's for breakfast. It's did I successfully maintain the cosmic balance while I was unconscious? Because in ancient Egyptian theology, even your dreams had cosmic significance. Your subconscious was literally responsible for keeping the forces of chaos called Isfit from destroying the world. Imagine having that kind of performance anxiety every single day. But wait, it gets worse. Because not only are you responsible for cosmic maintenance, you're also completely isolated from normal human interaction. Everyone who speaks to you has to prostrate themselves. They can't look you in the eye. They can't touch you without permission, and if they do, it's considered a crime, punishable by death. You know that feeling when you're the only one laughing at your own joke? Multiply that by infinity, because literally everyone around you is either terrified of you or trying to manipulate you. There's no such thing as a genuine conversation when people believe you can smite them with a thought. Let's talk about your daily routine, because this is where the psychological torture really kicks in. First, you can't dress yourself. Not because you don't know how, though honestly, after years of this, you might forget, but because the ritual of dressing the pharaoh is a religious ceremony. Every piece of clothing, every accessory, every cosmetic application is performed by priests who believe they're literally preparing a god for public appearance. The false beard, that's not just fashion, it's a symbol of divine wisdom that connects you to Osiris, god of the afterlife. The Urius serpent on your forehead. That's supposed to be a living cobra that spits fire at your enemies. The crook and flail. Ancient symbols of kingship that you'll be buried with when you die. And speaking of death, oh boy, do we need to talk about your relationship with death. Because from the moment you become Pharaoh, your entire life becomes an elaborate preparation for dying. See, normal people get to live their lives and then worry about death later. Your tomb construction starts on day one of your reign. Thousands of workers spending decades carving out your eternal resting place, creating the most elaborate burial chamber in human history, all while you're still trying to figure out basic adulting skills like running a kingdom. The psychological impact of this is staggering. Imagine being a teenager and knowing that somewhere in the desert, thousands of people are working full-time on your grave. That's not morbid curiosity. That's your daily reality. And here's the truly disturbing part. You can't even visit your own tomb while it's being built. It's considered bad luck. So you're financing the most expensive construction project in the ancient world. And you're not allowed to see it until you're dead. Talk about the ultimate case of FOMO. But the death obsession goes deeper than just tomb construction. Your entire identity as Pharaoh is built around your relationship with the afterlife. You're not just a king, you're Horus, the living god. But when you die, you become Osiris, the dead god. Your entire existence is defined by this transition from living deity to dead deity. Think about that for a second. Your life's purpose is to die properly. Modern people complain about work-life balance. You don't get to have a life separate from work because you are the work. You're not performing the job of Pharaoh, you are the job. There's no clocking out, no weekends, no vacation days. You are the Pharaoh 24/7 until the day you die, and even then, you're still Pharaoh in the afterlife. The isolation is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of all this. As Pharaoh, you exist in a bubble of absolute power and absolute loneliness. Everyone needs something from you. Everyone fears you. Everyone worships you. But nobody actually knows you. Your closest advisors see you as a political tool. Your priests see you as a religious symbol. Your family sees you as the source of their power and status. But who sees you as a human being? The answer is nobody. Because officially, you're not a human being. You're a god temporarily wearing human form. And this brings us to one of the most psychologically damaging aspects of pharaonic life. The complete absence of genuine human connection. You can't have real friends, because friendship implies equality, and you're supposedly superior to all other humans. You can't have honest conversations, because people tell you what they think you want to hear, not what they actually think. Even your marriages are political arrangements designed to strengthen the dynasty or forge alliances. Love, that's for regular people. You get strategic reproductive partnerships. Your children, they're not just your kids, they're potential heirs, political assets, or bargaining chips in diplomatic negotiations. Every interaction with them is colored by the knowledge that they might one day replace you, or worse, challenge your authority. The paranoia this creates is intense. Throughout Egyptian history, pharaohs lived in constant fear of palace coups, assassinations, and family conspiracies, and they were right to be afraid. Many pharaohs were murdered by their own relatives or trusted advisors. Ramesses III, one of Egypt's greatest pharaohs, was killed in a harem conspiracy involving his own wives and children. His throat was slit, probably while he slept. So much for divine protection. Amenemheb II was possibly murdered by his own son. Tai, the mother of Akhenaten, may have been involved in her husband's death to secure power for her son. when your own family can't be trusted, when your closest advisors might be plotting against you, when even your food tasters could be compromised, the psychological toll is enormous. You develop a kind of hypervigilance that modern psychologists associate with severe PTSD. You can't relax, you can't trust, you can't be vulnerable with anyone because vulnerability equals death. And yet, you're expected to project absolute confidence and divine authority at all times. You have to appear omniscient and infallible while living in constant fear and uncertainty. It's like being the world's most powerful person and the world's most paranoid prisoner at the same time. But here's what makes it even more disturbing. You were probably trained for this from birth. If you were lucky enough to be born as the heir apparent, your childhood was systematically designed to prepare you for this life of isolated power and cosmic responsibility. No normal play. No regular friendships. No learning about the world through exploration and mistakes. Instead, you got tutors teaching you hieroglyphics, religious protocols, administrative procedures, and military tactics. While other kids were learning to be human, you were learning to be a god. The psychological development implications of this are staggering. Normal human development requires interaction with peers, the ability to fail safely, opportunities for genuine self-expression, and gradual assumption of responsibility. You got none of that. Instead, you got accelerated deity training, which basically amounts to systematic dehumanization disguised as divine preparation. And if you think that sounds harsh, wait until you hear about the physical aspects of being Pharaoh. Because being a living god isn't just psychologically devastating, it's also really, really gross. Alright, let's talk about something that's going to make you appreciate modern plumbing, personal hygiene, when you're supposedly a perfect divine being who can't be seen doing anything as mundane as well basic human functions. Here's the thing about being a god. Gods don't poop. At least, that's what your subjects believe. So what do you do when nature calls and you're literally considered a perfect divine entity? You develop the most elaborate bathroom protocols in human history. Picture this. You're sitting on your throne, conducting the daily administrative business of running an empire. Thousands of officials, petitioners, and courtiers are watching your every move, hanging on your every word, analyzing your facial expressions for signs of divine displeasure. And then you feel it. That unmistakable pressure that means you need to handle some very ungodly business. But you can't just excuse yourself like a normal person. You can't say, "Hey guys, nature's calling, I'll be right back." Because gods don't have bodily functions. Gods are perfect. Gods don't deal with the messy realities of human biology. So instead, you have to maintain perfect divine composure while your bowels are actively trying to betray your godhood. The solution? A complex system of signals, protocols, and intermediaries that would make modern diplomatic procedures look simple. First, you give a specific gesture, maybe touching your ceremonial beard or adjusting your crown, that signals to your closest attendant that you need privacy. This attendant, who has been trained from birth for this exact moment, then initiates a carefully choreographed sequence of events. Incense is burned. Prayers are chanted. The court is informed that the pharaoh must retire to consult with the gods on matters of cosmic importance. Everyone prostrates themselves as you slowly, majestically exit the throne room, maintaining perfect divine bearing while your digestive system stages its rebellion. But here's where it gets really disturbing. Even your bathroom breaks are religious ceremonies. You're not just using a toilet. You're performing a sacred ritual of purification. Special priests, called guardians of the sacred vessel, are responsible for your waste management. They've trained for years to handle the theological implications of divine excrement. Think about that job description for a second. Wanted religious official to manage God's bathroom needs. Must be comfortable with theological discussions about divine digestive processes. Previous experience with cosmic waste management preferred. And these weren't just any priests. These were highly educated, well-respected religious officials who had dedicated their lives to studying the intersection of divinity and human biology. They had elaborate theories about how divine substances should be handled, where they should be disposed of, and what rituals needed to be performed to maintain cosmic balance. Your urine wasn't just waste. It was a sacred fluid that needed to be properly blessed and disposed of, according to specific religious protocols. Your feces weren't just excrement. They were divine byproducts that required ceremonial handling. I'm not making this up. Archaeological evidence shows that pharaohs had private bathroom facilities that were essentially temples, complete with religious imagery, ceremonial vessels, and spaces for priest attendance. But the bathroom situation is just the beginning of your hygiene nightmares. Let's talk about bathing. Normal people can take a bath whenever they want, however they want. Your bath time is a religious ceremony that takes hours and requires the participation of dozens of people. Every morning, you undergo what's essentially a ritualistic human car wash. First, your priests of purification prepare the sacred bathing chamber. The water isn't just water, it's been blessed, perfumed, and mixed with specific oils, according to religious formulas that have been passed down for generations. You can't just jump in and splash around. Oh no. You have to be ceremonially undressed by the keepers of the sacred garments, who fold each piece of clothing according to specific religious protocols while chanting prayers for your continued divine perfection. Then you're led to the bathing pool, and I use the term pool loosely because it's more like a small temple with water in it. The walls are covered in hieroglyphics describing your divine nature. The ceiling shows your journey through the underworld. Even the soap is made according to sacred recipes. But here's the kicker. You're not allowed to wash yourself. That would be undignified for a god. Instead, specially trained priests perform the bathing ritual on your behalf. They scrub, they rinse, they oil, they perfume, all while chanting prayers and maintaining proper religious decorum. Imagine being a grown adult and not being allowed to wash your own body. Every bath is like being an infant. Except the people washing you are elderly religious officials who are taking the whole thing very, very seriously. And speaking of taking things seriously, let's talk about your hair. Your hair isn't just hair. It's a divine crown that requires constant maintenance by specialized hair priests who have studied the religious significance of every strand. Bad hair day, not an option. Your hair has to be perfect at all times because it's literally part of your godhood. Thinning hair, grey hair, anything that suggests you're aging like a normal human. That's a theological crisis that requires immediate intervention. The Egyptians had elaborate wigs, hairpieces, and treatments designed to maintain the illusion of divine perfection. But wearing a wig wasn't just vanity. It was a religious requirement. Your appearance had to match your subjects' expectations of what a god should look like. And those famous Egyptian hairstyles weren't just fashion choices. They were religious symbols with specific meanings. The way your hair was arranged communicated theological concepts to anyone who could read the visual language. Think about the psychological impact of this. You can't even have a bad hair day without it becoming a crisis of faith for millions of people. But wait, there's more. Let's talk about your teeth. In ancient Egypt, dental hygiene was basically non-existent by modern standards. Even wealthy people had terrible teeth by the time they reached middle age. But you're not just wealthy, you're a god. Gods don't have dental problems. So what happens when your teeth start rotting? Which they inevitably will, because ancient Egyptian diets were terrible for dental health. You get the most elaborate dental cover-up in history. Special dentist priests developed techniques for masking dental problems that wouldn't be out of place in a modern cosmetic dentistry office. Gold caps, gemstone inlays, elaborate bridge work, all designed to maintain the illusion that your teeth are as perfect as the rest of your divine form. But here's the disturbing part. These procedures were performed without anesthesia. You had to endure hours of dental work while maintaining perfect divine composure. No grimacing, no crying out in pain, no showing any sign that you were experiencing discomfort, because gods don't feel pain. Gods are perfect. Gods certainly don't whimper while getting their teeth fixed. Archaeological evidence from pharaonic mummies shows extensive dental work, much of it performed on living patients. Some pharaohs had their teeth completely reconstructed with precious metals and gems. Others had elaborate prosthetics designed to hide missing or damaged teeth. And all of this had to be done in secret, because acknowledging that you needed dental work would undermine the entire theological foundation of your authority. Your skin was another source of constant anxiety. Gods don't age. Gods don't get wrinkles. Gods certainly don't get skin conditions or scars or anything that might suggest they're mortal. So you had teams of cosmetic specialists whose job was to maintain the illusion of eternal youth. They used makeup techniques that were incredibly advanced for their time: foundations, concealers, anti-aging treatments made from exotic ingredients. But applying makeup to a god isn't like applying makeup to a normal person. Every cosmetic choice had religious significance. The colors, the patterns, the techniques, all of it communicated specific theological concepts. Your eye makeup wasn't just for beauty, it was supposed to give you the vision of a god. The coal around your eyes contained actual gold and precious stones because divine sight required divine materials. Your face paint wasn't just decoration, it was religious war paint that proclaimed your divine authority and scared away evil spirits. And all of this had to be applied perfectly every single day by priests, who had trained for decades to understand the religious implications of cosmetic choices. Think about the pressure. If your makeup artist had an off day, it wasn't just a beauty mishap, it was a theological crisis. Your appearance had to be so perfect that it reinforced your subjects' belief in your divinity. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of pharaonic hygiene was the complete lack of privacy. Every intimate bodily function, every aspect of personal care, every private moment was witnessed and managed by religious officials. You couldn't scratch an itch without someone analyzing the theological implications. You couldn't yawn without priests wondering if you were receiving divine visions. You couldn't have a normal human moment without it becoming a religious event. The psychological impact of this level of scrutiny and control is hard to imagine. Normal human development requires privacy, autonomy, and the ability to be imperfect in private. You got none of that. Instead, you lived in a fishbowl where your most intimate moments were religious ceremonies performed by other people. And this brings us to one of the most psychologically damaging aspects of pharaonic life: the complete inability to be authentically human. Every natural human response had to be suppressed or transformed into a divine performance. You couldn't be tired, hungry, sick, sad, confused, or uncertain because gods don't experience these human limitations. So you learned to hide your humanity so completely that you probably forgot what it felt like to be genuinely yourself. But if you think the hygiene situation was bad, wait until you hear about pharaonic dining. Because eating when you're a god is a whole other level of disturbing complexity. Let me ask you something. When was the last time you just grabbed a snack without thinking about it? Maybe reached into the fridge, pulled out some leftovers, microwaved them for 30 seconds, and ate while scrolling through your phone. Yeah, well, forget that ever happening again. Because when you're a pharaoh, every single bite of food you consume is a theological event of cosmic significance. We're not talking about fancy state dinners or ceremonial banquets, though those are their own special kind of nightmare. We're talking about every mundane snack, every casual meal, every moment when normal people would just eat food. Picture this, it's mid-afternoon. You've been sitting in court for 6 hours straight, listening to administrative reports, and you're getting hungry. Normal person responds, "Hey, can someone grab me a sandwich?" Pharaoh responds, "Initiate the sacred nourishment protocol. First, your keeper of the divine appetite must be notified that the god requires sustenance. This isn't a person bringing you food. This is a highly trained religious official whose entire career revolves around the theological implications of your nutritional needs. They don't ask what you want to eat. They consult with the palace astronomers to determine what foods are cosmically appropriate for your consumption at this exact moment in time. The position of the stars, the phase of the moon, the seasonal calendar, the religious calendar, and your divine responsibilities all factor into what you're allowed to consume. Craving a specific food. Too bad, the cosmos doesn't care about your personal preferences. But let's say the stars align and you're permitted to eat. Now we enter the most elaborate food preparation ritual in human history. Your food isn't just cooked, it's consecrated. Every ingredient must be blessed by specific priests who specialize in that particular type of food. The priest of sacred grains blesses your bread. The keeper of divine flesh sanctifies your meat. The guardian of holy beverages performs purification rituals on your wine. And these aren't quick blessings. Each ingredient requires specific prayers, ritual gestures, and waiting periods. Your simple meal might require hours of religious preparation before you can take the first bite. But wait, there's more. Because once the food is prepared, it has to be tested. Not just for poison, though that's definitely a concern when everyone around you might be plotting your assassination, but for theological purity. You see, eating the wrong food could compromise your divine essence. Consuming something that hasn't been properly blessed could diminish your godhood. So every dish has to be examined by religious experts who can determine whether it's suitable for divine consumption. Think about that for a second. You can't even eat a piece of bread without a theological committee approving it first. And then there's the actual eating process, which is perhaps the most psychologically disturbing part of the entire ordeal. You don't get to eat like a normal person. You can't pick up food with your hands, bite into it casually, or chew with your mouth open. Every aspect of your consumption has to reinforce your divine nature. Special utensils made from precious metals and blessed according to specific religious protocols. Specific posture requirements that ensure you maintain divine dignity while eating. Particular chewing techniques that demonstrate your superiority to mortal beings. But here's the kicker. You're not allowed to show enjoyment. Gods don't experience pleasure in the same way humans do. So while you might be eating the most delicious food in the ancient world, and Pharaonic cuisine was legendary, you have to maintain perfect divine composure throughout the entire meal. No mounds, no facial expressions of satisfaction, no casual conversation about how good the food tastes. You consume your meal with the same majestic indifference you display when receiving tribute from foreign kingdoms. Imagine eating your favorite meal while having to pretend you're completely uninterested in it. That's your dining experience every single time. And if you think eating in private would solve this problem, think again. Gods don't eat alone. Every meal is witnessed by various court officials, priests, and attendants who need to observe your dining habits for both security and religious reasons. Your table manners are constantly analyzed for signs of divine approval or displeasure. The way you handle your utensils communicates messages about the kingdom's future. Your eating speed indicates the cosmic urgency of various political matters. Eat too fast. You must be receiving divine visions about urgent matters requiring immediate attention. Eat too slow. The gods are counseling patience and deliberation. Push food around your plate. Clearly, you're contemplating the deep mysteries of the universe. Every mundane dining moment becomes a theological interpretation session. But let's talk about what you're actually eating, because pharaonic cuisine wasn't just fancy, it was weird. Really, really weird. See, normal people eat food for nutrition and enjoyment. Your food serves multiple purposes: nutrition, religious symbolism, political messaging, and magical protection. Your bread isn't just bread, it's shaped into sacred symbols that reinforce your connection to the gods. Your meat isn't just protein, it's carefully selected from animals that have been ritually sacrificed according to specific religious protocols. Your wine isn't just alcohol, it's been blessed with spells designed to enhance your divine wisdom and protect you from supernatural threats. Some of the ingredients in pharaonic cuisine would make modern people physically ill. Fermented fish sauce that smelled like death, but was considered a divine delicacy. Honey mixed with herbs that had psychoactive properties. Wine fortified with ground precious stones, because consuming literal wealth was supposed to enhance your divine power. And then there were the truly disturbing elements. Foods made from animals that were considered sacred, requiring elaborate justification rituals to explain why it was acceptable for you to consume them. Dishes prepared with ingredients that had been blessed in specific temples by priests who fasted for weeks to purify themselves for the honor of contributing to your meal. One particularly disturbing example: certain pharaohs consumed preparations made from the organs of sacred animals that had been specially bred and raised in temple complexes. These animals lived better lives than most humans, received daily religious blessings, and were fed diets more elaborate than what most nobles consumed, all so they could eventually be sacrificed and prepared as pharaonic cuisine. Think about the psychological impact of eating something that lived better than most of your subjects. But perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of pharaonic dining was the complete disconnection from normal food experiences. You never got to cook for yourself. You never got to choose what to eat based on personal cravings or preferences. You never got to share a casual meal with friends or family where conversation was more important than food presentation. Food became just another aspect of your performance as a god. Every meal was a ritual. Every bite was a theological statement. Every dining experience reinforced your isolation from normal human experiences. And this extended to your relationship with alcohol, which gets really dark really fast. In ancient Egypt, beer and wine weren't just recreational substances. They were religious sacraments with serious spiritual significance. But as Pharaoh, your relationship with alcohol was particularly complex and disturbing. On one hand, you were expected to demonstrate divine self-control and wisdom in all things, including alcohol consumption. Gods don't get drunk like mortals. Gods don't lose their composure or make poor decisions because they've had too much wine. On the other hand, Certain religious ceremonies required you to consume specific alcoholic preparations that were designed to enhance your connection to the divine realm. These weren't casual drinks, they were carefully prepared religious compounds that could have serious psychoactive effects. Some pharaohs were essentially required to consume what we would now recognize as drug cocktails disguised as religious wine. The goal was to induce altered states of consciousness that would allow them to communicate with gods, receive divine visions, or perform miraculous feats. But here's the disturbing part. You had to maintain perfect divine composure, while potentially experiencing intense hallucinations or altered mental states. The religious preparations could cause anything from mild euphoria to full-blown psychedelic experiences. But you couldn't show any signs that you were impaired. Imagine being completely intoxicated while having to conduct serious governmental business and maintain the appearance of divine wisdom and infallibility. Archaeological evidence suggests that some pharaohs developed serious substance abuse problems as a result of these religious requirements. When your job description includes regular consumption of psychoactive substances, and when the pressures of absolute power and isolation are constantly grinding away at your psychological stability, addiction becomes almost inevitable. But you couldn't admit to having substance abuse problems because gods don't have weaknesses or dependencies. So pharaohs who struggled with alcohol or drug issues had to hide their problems while continuing to perform their religious and governmental duties. The historical records show several pharaohs who died young under mysterious circumstances that modern analysis suggests were probably overdoses or alcohol-related deaths. But at the time, these deaths were attributed to divine translation to the afterlife or assassination by supernatural enemies. And speaking of things that could kill you, let's talk about food poisoning when you're supposed to be immortal. Your food preparation was elaborate and religious, but it wasn't necessarily safe by modern standards. Ancient preservation methods were primitive. Refrigeration didn't exist. Food safety protocols were based on religious beliefs rather than scientific understanding of bacteria and contamination. So you could easily get food poisoning from a meal that'd been prepared by the most elite chefs in the kingdom and blessed by the most powerful priests in Egypt. But gods don't get food poisoning. Gods have perfect divine digestion that can't be compromised by mortal concerns like bacterial contamination. So when you inevitably got sick from contaminated food, you had to pretend it wasn't happening. You had to maintain perfect divine composure while your digestive system was staging a full revolt. You had to conduct governmental business while experiencing severe gastrointestinal distress that you couldn't acknowledge or treat openly. The palace physicians could help, but they had to disguise food poisoning treatment as religious purification rituals. You weren't being treated for a medical condition. You were undergoing spiritual cleansing to remove divine impurities. Think about the psychological impact of not being able to acknowledge when you're physically ill. Normal people can call in sick, take medicine, rest until they feel better. You had to pretend to be perfectly healthy while potentially dying from food poisoning. And this brings us to one of the most disturbing aspects of pharaonic dining: the constant performance of perfection in the face of normal human biological responses. Every meal was a test. Every bite was scrutinized. Every dining experience had to reinforce the illusion that you were a perfect divine being who existed above normal human limitations. But you weren't above human limitations. You were just forced to pretend that you were, even when your body was actively proving otherwise. The psychological toll of this constant performance, this complete disconnection from authentic human experiences, this isolation from the simple pleasures that make life bearable. It's hard to imagine how anyone could maintain their sanity under these conditions. And yet pharaohs were expected to do exactly that for decades, while making life and death decisions for millions of people. But if you think the dining situation was psychologically damaging, wait until we talk about marriage and family life, when everyone you love is either a political asset or a potential threat to your power. Okay, let's talk about something that's going to make you appreciate your dysfunctional family. Trying to have meaningful relationships. When you're literally worshipped as a god, and everyone around you has ulterior motives. First, let's address the elephant in the room. Pharaonic marriages were not about love. They were about genetics, politics, and maintaining the divine bloodline. And when I say maintaining the divine bloodline, I mean something that's going to make your skin crawl. You ready for this? Pharaohs regularly married their sisters, daughters, and other close relatives to keep their divine blood pure. I know what you're thinking. Come on, that's just ancient Egyptian weirdness, right? They didn't really understand genetics back then. Wrong. They absolutely understood that incest could cause serious problems. They just decided that maintaining divine bloodline purity was more important than avoiding genetic disasters. So picture this. You're 12 years old, you've just inherited the throne, and your advisors inform you that you need to marry your 10-year-old sister to ensure the continuation of the divine dynasty. Not your stepsister from a different marriage. Not a distant cousin. Your actual biological sister who you grew up with, played with, and probably had normal sibling arguments with just a few years earlier. And this isn't presented as a weird political necessity that everyone feels uncomfortable about. This is presented as your divine duty, your religious obligation, your cosmic responsibility to maintain the purity of the godly bloodline. The psychological impact of this is staggering. Normal sibling relationships are complicated enough without adding marriage, sexual expectations, and dynastic pressure. But as Pharaoh, you don't get to have normal family relationships. You get strategically arranged reproductive partnerships with people you're genetically programmed to think of as family. And it gets worse. Because these weren't just marriages, they were breeding programs designed to produce heirs with maximum divine blood concentration. Your wife, who might be your sister, half-sister, daughter, or niece, wasn't your romantic partner. She was essentially a divinely approved baby-making machine whose primary job was to give birth to future pharaohs with the highest possible concentration of godly genetics. The pressure on these relationships was enormous. Every aspect of your marriage was scrutinized by court officials, religious authorities, and political advisors who all had opinions about optimal breeding strategies. Your sex life wasn't private. It was a matter of state security. Court officials needed to know when you were trying to conceive, because the timing of royal births had political and religious implications. Palace physicians monitored your wife's menstrual cycle and fertility signs to maximize the chances of producing male heirs. Think about that for a second. Your most intimate moments were being tracked, analyzed, and optimized by government bureaucrats. But here's where it gets really disturbing. What happened when these incestuous marriages produced children with serious genetic problems? Because they absolutely did. Modern analysis of pharaonic mummies shows clear evidence of genetic disorders that were almost certainly caused by generations of incestuous breeding. Birth defects, developmental disabilities, shortened lifespans, fertility problems, all the predictable consequences of repeatedly marrying close relatives. But gods don't produce imperfect children. Divine bloodlines don't carry genetic flaws. So when your child was born with obvious problems caused by incest, everyone had to pretend it wasn't happening. Children with visible birth defects were hidden from public view. Heirs with developmental disabilities were managed by specially trained attendants who helped them maintain the appearance of divine perfection. Some genetically compromised princes and princesses were essentially kept as palace prisoners, receiving excellent care, but never allowed to appear in public where their imperfections might undermine the divine bloodline mythology. And you, as their parent, had to participate in this cover-up. You couldn't acknowledge your child's problems, seek appropriate medical care, or grieve the fact that your reproductive choices had caused their suffering. Instead, you had to maintain the pretense that your genetically damaged children were perfect divine beings destined for greatness. The guilt and psychological trauma of this situation is almost unimaginable. Normal parents can acknowledge their children's challenges and work to address them. You had to pretend your children were perfect while watching them struggle with problems that you had directly caused through your marriage choices. But let's say you got lucky and your incestuous marriage produced relatively healthy children. Now you get to deal with a whole different set of psychological nightmares, raising kids who might eventually kill you to steal your throne. See, in pharaonic succession, there was always ambiguity about exactly which child would inherit the throne. Primogeniture, where the oldest son automatically inherits, wasn't consistently followed. Sometimes younger sons with better political connections seized power. Sometimes daughters married powerful nobles who then claimed the throne through their wives. Sometimes adopted heirs or stepchildren eliminated biological children to secure their positions. This created a family dynamic that can only be described as a continuous death match disguised as normal parenting. Every interaction with your children was colored by the knowledge that they might eventually decide you needed to die for their own advancement. Every conversation about politics or governance was potentially giving them information they could use against you. Every display of weakness or vulnerability could be exploited in a future coup attempt. And your children knew this too. They grew up understanding that their relationship with you wasn't just father-child or mother-child. It was potential competitor and current obstacle to their own divine destiny. Imagine trying to have a normal family dinner when everyone at the table is calculating whether murdering each other would improve their political positions. The historical records are full of examples of pharaonic family members killing each other in spectacularly brutal ways. Hatshepsut possibly poisoned her stepson, Thutmose III, who then spent decades destroying every monument and record of her reign in revenge. Amenemheb II might have been murdered by his own son. Ramesses III was killed in a conspiracy involving multiple wives and children who were competing for succession rights. But perhaps the most psychologically disturbing aspect of pharaonic family life was the complete absence of unconditional love. Normal families, even dysfunctional ones, operate on the assumption that family members care about each other regardless of external circumstances. Parents love their children even when they're disappointed in them. Siblings support each other even when they disagree. Pharaonic families operated more like criminal organizations where personal affection was always secondary to political advantage. Your spouse loved you as long as you were useful for their own power and status. Your children respected you as long as you were too strong to overthrow. Your parents supported you as long as your success reflected well on them. But if your political position weakened, if your health declined, if your decision-making became questionable, well, suddenly, family loyalty became much more conditional. And you knew this. You lived every day understanding that the people closest to you were also the people most likely to betray you if circumstances changed. The psychological impact of this kind of conditional love is devastating. Human beings need to believe that at least some relationships in their lives are based on genuine care rather than strategic calculation. You've got none of that. Instead, you got strategic alliances disguised as family relationships, breeding partnerships disguised as marriages, and political maneuvering disguised as parental love. Let's talk about what it was like trying to be a parent under these circumstances. Normal parents want their children to be happy, healthy, and successful according to their own definitions of those terms. You wanted your children to be politically useful, dynastically valuable, and unlikely to murder you. Different priorities entirely. Your parenting decisions weren't based on what was best for your children's emotional development or personal fulfillment. They were based on what would best serve the kingdom's political needs and your own survival. A child who showed independence and leadership qualities, potentially dangerous, they might use those traits to challenge your authority. A child who was popular with the military or nobility, definitely threatening, they could build a power base for a coup attempt. A child who questioned royal protocols or suggested reforms, absolutely terrifying, they might decide you're an obstacle to progress. So you found yourself in the bizarre position of hoping your children would be competent enough to eventually rule effectively, but not so competent that they'd decide you needed to be eliminated immediately. You had to encourage their development while simultaneously undermining their confidence. You had to prepare them for leadership while making sure they never felt secure enough to challenge you. You had to love them while always being ready to have them killed if they became too threatening. Talk about impossible parenting goals. And your children picked up on this, because kids always understand family dynamics better than adults think they do. They learned early that their relationship with you was fundamentally competitive rather than supportive. This created a generation of royals who were simultaneously entitled and paranoid, confident in their divine status but unable to trust anyone. Trained for leadership but psychologically damaged by the process. Many pharaonic heirs developed what modern psychologists would recognize as severe personality disorders. Grandiose narcissism combined with paranoid tendencies, inability to form genuine emotional connections, compulsive need for control and validation, explosive anger when challenged or questioned. Some became sadistic tyrants who took pleasure in exercising absolute power over others. Others became paranoid recluses who trusted no one and saw threats everywhere. A few became so psychologically damaged that they were essentially non-functional as leaders, relying entirely on advisors and bureaucrats to run the kingdom while they retreated into private worlds of ritual and fantasy. But even functional pharaohs carried the psychological scars of growing up in families where love was conditional. Trust was dangerous, and emotional vulnerability could be fatal. And then there's the issue of what happened to your children who didn't inherit the throne. In some dynasties, non-inheriting royal children were given prestigious but powerless positions, religious titles, administrative roles, ceremonial responsibilities that kept them busy but politically irrelevant. In other dynasties, they were systematically eliminated to prevent future succession disputes. Sometimes this was done through accidents or illnesses. Sometimes they were simply murdered outright and their deaths attributed to divine will. Imagine knowing that your succession decision would determine not just who became the next pharaoh, but also which of your other children would live or die. Normal parents worry about providing for all their children and ensuring they have good opportunities. You had to decide which ones to kill to protect the kingdom's stability. The psychological burden of making these kinds of decisions is almost impossible to comprehend. You're simultaneously a parent who presumably loves your children and a political leader who needs to eliminate threats to dynastic security. And your children knew this too. They grew up understanding that their siblings weren't just competition for parental attention. They were literally life or death rivals, whose very existence might require their elimination. This created royal families, where sibling relationships were characterized by constant fear, suspicion, and strategic maneuvering. Brothers and sisters who should have been natural allies and sources of emotional support instead became mortal enemies engaged in elaborate plots against each other. And you, as the parent, had to manage these dynamics while maintaining the appearance of a harmonious royal family. You couldn't acknowledge the dysfunction, seek family therapy, or address the underlying problems that were destroying your children's psychological development. Instead, you had to present your family as a perfect example of divine harmony, while privately managing what was essentially an ongoing civil war between your own children. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of pharaonic family life was what happened to the spouses who genuinely tried to love their pharaoh partners despite the political complications. Because, occasionally, despite all the strategic marriage arrangements and political calculations, people did fall in love. Sometimes a pharaoh and their spouse developed genuine emotional connections that transcended the political necessity of their union. And this made everything worse. Love requires vulnerability, trust, and emotional honesty. But vulnerability could be exploited by enemies. Trust could be betrayed by ambitious spouses, and emotional honesty could reveal weaknesses that undermined divine authority. So pharaohs, who genuinely loved their spouses, faced an impossible choice: maintain the emotional distance necessary for political survival, or risk everything for authentic human connection. Most chose political survival. They learned to compartmentalize their emotions, treating their spouses as political assets while suppressing their genuine feelings. But some pharaohs chose love, and the results were usually catastrophic. They made political decisions based on emotional rather than strategic considerations. They shared power with spouses who then used that access to advance their own agendas. They became emotionally dependent on people who might eventually betray them. The historical records show several pharaohs whose reigns were undermined by their genuine love for their spouses. They gave their wives too much political influence, trusted them with sensitive information, or made succession decisions based on romantic feelings rather than dynastic logic. And when these relationships inevitably became politically problematic, the pharaohs faced a choice that normal people never have to make: eliminate the person they love to save their kingdom, or risk everything for a relationship that might ultimately destroy them. Some chose love and lost their thrones. Others chose power and lost their humanity. But all of them paid a psychological price that's difficult to imagine. The constant calculation, the perpetual vigilance, the complete inability to have authentic relationships with the people who should have been closest to them. It's a recipe for profound psychological damage that no amount of power or wealth could compensate for. And this brings us to something that might be the most disturbing aspect of pharaonic family life: the impact on the royal children who witnessed all of this dysfunction and were expected to continue the system when they inherited power. These kids grew up watching their parents navigate relationships based on fear, manipulation, and strategic calculation rather than love, trust, and emotional support. They learned that family members were threats to be managed rather than people to be cherished. They saw siblings eliminated, spouses betrayed, and parents murdered by their own relatives. They understood from childhood that emotional vulnerability was dangerous and that genuine human connection was a luxury they couldn't afford. Is it any wonder that many pharaohs became psychologically damaged individuals who perpetuated and amplified the same dysfunctional patterns they had grown up with? The cycle of paranoid isolation, strategic relationships, and emotional dysfunction was passed down through generations, creating dynasties of increasingly damaged individuals who were simultaneously the most powerful people in the world and the most psychologically isolated. But wait, we're not done with the family nightmare yet. Because we haven't even talked about the extended royal family, the cousins, uncles, aunts, and in-laws, who were all jockeying for position while pretending to be supportive relatives. Stay tuned, because next we're diving into something that's going to make family Thanksgiving dinners look like peaceful diplomatic summits, the daily court life of ancient Egypt, where every conversation is a potential death sentence, and every smile might hide a knife. Alright, let's talk about your social life as Pharaoh. And when I say social life, I mean the most psychologically exhausting performance art project in human history, where every conversation could end with someone's execution and every friendly gesture might be a prelude to assassination. First, let me set the scene for you. Picture the most elaborate, expensive, intimidating building you've ever seen. Now multiply that by about 1,000 and add religious significance to every single decorative element. That's your workplace, the Pharaonic palace complex. But this isn't just a big fancy house where you happen to live. This is a carefully designed psychological warfare machine built to reinforce your divine authority while simultaneously isolating you from any genuine human interaction. Every room is designed to make visitors feel small and overwhelmed. The ceilings are impossibly high, covered with paintings of you performing godly feats like controlling the sun and defeating mythological monsters. The walls are lined with hieroglyphics describing your divine nature and cosmic responsibilities. Even the furniture is designed to communicate your superiority. Your throne sits elevated above everyone else. Your dining table is positioned to ensure you're always the center of attention. Your bed is literally shaped like a temple to emphasize that your sleep is a religious activity. And every single day, this psychological intimidation chamber is filled with hundreds of people who need something from you, fear you, or are plotting against you. Welcome to court life. Let's start with a typical morning audience, because this is where the psychological horror really begins. You wake up at dawn because pharaohs don't get to sleep in, and after your elaborate morning hygiene ritual that we discussed earlier, you're dressed in ceremonial regalia that weighs about 50 pounds and makes normal movement impossible. Then you're led to the throne room, where anywhere from 50 to 500 people are waiting to petition you, report to you, or simply demonstrate their loyalty by prostrating themselves in your presence. But here's the kicker. You can't just sit down and start handling business like a normal person. Every aspect of your entrance is choreographed theater designed to reinforce your divine status. Music plays, incense burns, priests chant, guards perform ceremonial displays. Court officials recite your divine titles. And we're talking about a list that can take 10 minutes to get through because you're not just Pharaoh. You're Lord of the two lands, High Priest of every temple, beloved of Ra, chosen of Pater, living Horus, son of Re, Lord of appearances, King of Upper and Lower Egypt, and about 40 other titles that everyone has to listen to every single morning. By the time you're actually seated and ready to conduct business, everyone in the room has been standing in uncomfortable positions for at least 30 minutes, watching a religious ceremony dedicated to your awesomeness. And that's before you've said a single word. Now, let's talk about the people who are waiting to see you. Because understanding your daily social interactions requires understanding the psychological dynamics of everyone you're dealing with. First, you've got government officials who are reporting on administrative matters. Sounds boring, right? Wrong. Because in ancient Egypt, every administrative decision had political implications, and every political implication could affect your survival. That governor reporting on tax collection from his province, he's not just giving you numbers. He's demonstrating his loyalty, advertising his competence, and possibly positioning himself for promotion or elimination, depending on how you interpret his performance. If tax collection is up, is it because he's an excellent administrator, or because he's skimming money and has enough resources to bribe auditors? If tax collection is down, is it because of natural disasters and poor harvests, or because he's incompetent and needs to be replaced? Every routine administrative report requires you to engage in complex psychological analysis to determine the reporter's true motives, the accuracy of their information, and the political implications of your response. And here's the really disturbing part. You have to make these judgments based on extremely limited information while maintaining perfect divine composure. You can't ask follow-up questions that might suggest uncertainty or confusion. You can't take time to research and verify information. You can't show any signs that you're struggling to understand complex situations. Instead, you have to project omniscience while making potentially life or death decisions based on incomplete information provided by people who might be lying to you. Think about the psychological pressure of this. Every morning, you're required to demonstrate godlike wisdom and perfect judgment, while navigating political minefields that could destroy your kingdom if you make the wrong choices. And everyone in the room is watching your facial expressions, analyzing your tone of voice, and interpreting your body language for signs of divine approval or displeasure. Your slightest reaction becomes court gossip that spreads throughout the kingdom and influences political alliances. Yawn because you're tired. Clearly you're bored with that official's report, which means they're probably going to be demoted or eliminated. Smile because someone made an amusing comment. Obviously, you favor that person, which makes them a target for ambitious rivals who need to eliminate your favorites to advance their own positions. Every human reaction becomes a political statement with potentially deadly consequences for the people around you. But wait, it gets worse. Because mixed in with the legitimate government officials are people who are actively trying to manipulate, deceive, or potentially kill you. Foreign ambassadors who are gathering intelligence for enemy kingdoms while pretending to negotiate trade agreements. Religious officials who are advancing their own political agendas while claiming to speak for the gods. Military commanders who are testing your resolve and authority while reporting on border security. And you have to identify these threats while maintaining the appearance of serene divine confidence. Let's talk about a specific example that illustrates just how psychologically demanding these interactions could be. Imagine you're receiving a report from a border commander about raids by neighboring tribes. Sounds straightforward, right? Just military intelligence that requires appropriate defensive responses. But actually, this commander might be telling the truth about genuine external threats that require immediate military action, exaggerating minor incidents to justify requests for additional troops and resources, completely fabricating threats to distract attention from his own corruption or incompetence, acting on behalf of internal enemies who want to lure your military forces away from the capital, testing your resolve to see if you're strong enough to authorize military action or weak enough to be overthrown, and you have to figure out which scenario is true based on a 5-minute report delivered by someone who's been trained from birth to hide their true intentions behind elaborate court protocols. Oh, and while you're trying to perform this psychological analysis, you're also supposed to be channeling divine wisdom from the gods, maintaining perfect physical composure in 50 pounds of ceremonial regalia, and projecting absolute confidence in your decisions. No pressure at all. But the really disturbing part is what happens after you make your decision. Because whatever you choose, there will be consequences that ripple throughout the kingdom and affect thousands of people's lives. Authorize military action based on false information. You've just wasted resources and potentially provoked unnecessary conflicts with neighboring kingdoms. Ignore genuine threats because you suspected deception. You've left your people vulnerable to attacks that could devastate border communities. And either way, your decision becomes part of your reputation as a leader. Make too many wrong choices, and people start questioning your divine wisdom. Show too much uncertainty, and ambitious rivals start planning coups. The psychological burden of making these kinds of high-stakes decisions, multiple times per day, every day for decades, is almost impossible to imagine. But let's talk about the social dynamics that made court life even more psychologically exhausting. See, ancient Egyptian court culture was incredibly hierarchical and formal. Everyone had specific ranks, titles, and protocols that determined how they could interact with you and with each other. But unlike modern hierarchical organizations, where the rules are explicit and consistent, pharaonic court protocols were deliberately ambiguous and constantly changing based on your divine moods and political necessities. Someone who was favored yesterday might be out of favor today based on your interpretation of their behavior during morning audience. A minor official who impressed you with their competence might suddenly find themselves promoted to positions of major responsibility. A trusted advisor who made a single misjudgment might be demoted or eliminated without warning. This created a court culture where everyone was constantly trying to read your mind and anticipate your reactions, while hiding their own thoughts and motivations. Imagine being surrounded by hundreds of people who are all performing elaborate psychological theater designed to manipulate your perceptions while simultaneously trying to figure out what you want them to do. It's like being trapped in the world's most sophisticated psychological experiment, where everyone is both a test subject and a researcher, and the results determine who lives or dies. And the truly disturbing part is that you can't escape this environment. Court life isn't something you participate in occasionally. It's your entire social existence. You eat meals surrounded by courtiers who are analyzing your food choices for political significance. You take walks in gardens filled with officials who interpret your route selection as commentary on their relative importance. You attend religious ceremonies where every gesture is scrutinized for signs of divine favor or displeasure. Even your entertainment is part of the performance. When you watch dancers, musicians, or theatrical performances, everyone is watching you watch them to see how you react. Your enjoyment or boredom becomes a statement about royal taste that influences cultural trends throughout the kingdom. You can't just relax and enjoy something without it becoming a political statement. And let's talk about the courtiers themselves, because these people developed some truly disturbing psychological adaptations to survive in this environment. After years of court life, many courtiers became what modern psychologists would recognize as highly functional sociopaths. They learned to completely suppress their authentic emotions and reactions while projecting whatever persona they thought would be most advantageous at any given moment. They became expert manipulators who could read micro-expressions, detect deception, and craft elaborate lies while maintaining perfect social composure. They developed an almost supernatural ability to sense power shifts and realign. Their loyalties before political changes became obvious to others. But perhaps most disturbingly, they learned to treat human relationships as strategic resources rather than emotional connections. Friendships were alliances that could be abandoned when politically convenient. Romantic relationships were networking opportunities that could advance careers or provide access to sensitive information. Family bonds were either political assets to be leveraged or liabilities to be managed. These people spent their entire lives in a social environment where authentic human emotion was dangerous and, Strategic calculation was essential for survival. And you, as Pharaoh, were surrounded by these psychologically adapted court survivors, who had learned to hide their true selves so completely that they might have forgotten who they actually were underneath all the performance. Imagine trying to have genuine relationships with people who have been systematically trained to deceive and manipulate everyone they interact with. But here's what makes it even more psychologically disturbing. Many of these courtiers were incredibly intelligent, talented, and competent individuals who had been warped by the system into something almost inhuman. They weren't born evil or manipulative. They were often people who had started with genuine idealism, authentic emotions, and real desire to serve their kingdom effectively. But the court environment systematically rewarded deception and punished authenticity until these people learned to suppress their humanity in favor of strategic effectiveness. And watching this transformation happen to people around you, seeing intelligent, capable individuals gradually lose their ability to form genuine human connections, would have been psychologically devastating. You were simultaneously the cause of this psychological damage and its primary victim, because you were the most isolated person in an environment designed to prevent authentic human connection. Let me give you a specific example of how psychologically twisted court social dynamics could become. Let's say you have a trusted advisor who has served you faithfully for years. This person has demonstrated competence, loyalty, and genuine concern for the kingdom's welfare. Over time, you've developed what feels like a real friendship with them. They're one of the few people who seems to relate to you as a person rather than just a political symbol. But then you start noticing that this advisor's suggestions consistently benefit their own family members, promotions for their relatives, trade agreements that favor their business interests, military appointments that strengthen their political network. So now you have to decide, is this person your genuine friend who is unconsciously biased toward their own family? Or are they a sophisticated manipulator who has spent years building your trust specifically so they could exploit it for personal gain? And here's the kicker. There's no way to find out without destroying the relationship. If you confront them directly, you reveal that you've been suspicious of them, which undermines the trust that made the relationship valuable in the first place. If you test them by creating situations where their personal interests conflict with their loyalty to you, you're essentially manipulating someone who might be genuinely loyal, which makes you just as calculating as the people you're trying to protect yourself from. If you ignore the suspicious patterns, you risk being exploited by someone who has spent years positioning themselves to betray you. And if you eliminate them without confirmation of their disloyalty, you become the kind of paranoid tyrant who destroys innocent people based on suspicion rather than evidence. Every option is psychologically damaging and politically dangerous. This is the kind of impossible decision that pharaohs faced constantly in their relationships with courtiers. Every friendship was potentially a strategic deception. Every loyal advisor might be a long-term threat. Every person who seemed to genuinely care about you could be the most dangerous enemy of all. The psychological impact of living with this level of suspicion and uncertainty is devastating. It creates a form of hypervigilance that modern psychologists associate with severe trauma disorders. You can't relax, you can't trust, you can't be vulnerable with anyone because vulnerability could be fatal. But you also can't function effectively as a leader without some level of trust and collaboration with your advisors and officials. So you develop elaborate psychological defense mechanisms that allow you to maintain functional relationships while protecting yourself from potential betrayal. You learn to compartmentalize information so that no single person has enough knowledge to destroy you. You create multiple sources for important intelligence, so you can cross-reference information and detect deception. You develop testing scenarios that reveal people's true motivations without making your suspicions obvious. Essentially, you become a master manipulator yourself, not because you want to exploit others, but because it's the only way to survive in an environment where everyone else is potentially trying to exploit you. And this transformation from whatever kind of person you were before becoming Pharaoh into a hyper-vigilant, calculating, emotionally armored survivor is perhaps the most psychologically disturbing aspect of the entire experience. You don't just lose the ability to trust others, you lose the ability to trust yourself, because you're never sure whether your decisions are based on genuine wisdom or paranoid defensiveness. You start second-guessing every choice, analyzing every emotion, questioning every instinct. The psychological burden of constant self-monitoring and strategic calculation becomes so overwhelming that many pharaohs developed what we would now recognize as severe anxiety disorders, depression, and paranoid personality traits. But you can't acknowledge these psychological problems or seek treatment for them, because mental health issues would undermine your divine authority and provide ammunition for political enemies. So you suffer in isolation while maintaining the performance of perfect divine wisdom and emotional stability. And this brings us to one of the most heartbreaking aspects of pharaonic court life: the complete absence of psychological safety. Normal people have relationships and environments where they can be vulnerable, make mistakes, express uncertainty, and receive emotional support without fear of exploitation or judgment. You had none of that. Every environment was a performance space. Every relationship was a potential threat. Every moment of vulnerability could be weaponized against you. The psychological toll of never being able to let your guard down, never being able to seek comfort or support, never being able to admit confusion or fear. It's a form of emotional torture that no amount of power or luxury could compensate for. And yet this was your daily reality, not just for months or years, but potentially for decades. But wait, we're not done exploring the psychological nightmare of pharaonic life, because we haven't even talked about the religious responsibilities that dominated every aspect of your existence and required you to maintain a relationship with gods who might or might not actually exist. Get ready for the next chapter, because we're about to dive into something that makes court politics look simple. Trying to be an intermediary between the human and divine realms, when the gods have some very specific and very disturbing expectations for their earthly representative. Okay, here's where things get really psychologically twisted. We've talked about your isolation, your family dysfunction, your paranoid social life, but all of that is just the human side of being Pharaoh. Now we need to talk about your cosmic responsibilities, because remember, you're not just a political leader. You're literally a god with job duties that include maintaining the fundamental order of the universe. No pressure. Let me start with something that's going to blow your mind. As Pharaoh, you are personally responsible for making sure the sun rises every morning. I'm not being metaphorical here. According to ancient Egyptian theology, the sun god Ra battles the forces of chaos and darkness every night while traveling through the underworld. And your job, as his earthly representative, is to help him win this battle through specific rituals and prayers. So every single morning, before you can worry about normal things like eating breakfast or running your kingdom, you have to perform elaborate religious ceremonies designed to ensure that the cosmic order doesn't collapse into eternal darkness. Think about the psychological pressure of this responsibility. Every morning when you wake up, your first thought has to be, did the sun rise because I successfully completed yesterday's rituals, or did it rise despite my failures? And what do I need to do today to make sure it happens again tomorrow? You can't just assume the sun will continue rising like normal people do. You have to actively participate in cosmic maintenance, and if you mess up, the entire universe might end. But it gets worse, because the sun rising is just one of your cosmic responsibilities. The annual flooding of the Nile River, which determines whether millions of people eat or starve. The fertility of the land, which affects crop yields throughout Egypt. Protection from natural disasters, foreign invasions, and supernatural threats. Maintaining the balance between order and chaos is fit, in both the physical and spiritual realms. Ensuring that dead pharaohs successfully navigate the afterlife and continue protecting Egypt from beyond the grave, essentially. You're the cosmic IT department for reality itself. And, just like modern IT work, everyone blames you when things go wrong, but nobody notices when everything works correctly. Let's talk about what this actually looks like in practice. Because the daily religious obligations of being Pharaoh are absolutely insane. Your day starts at approximately 4 a.m. with what's called the morning hymn to Ra. This isn't a quick prayer. It's a complex ritual that takes about 2 hours and requires you to recite hundreds of lines of sacred text while performing specific gestures, offering various substances to divine statues, and maintaining perfect spiritual focus. And you can't just go through the motions. According to Egyptian theology, the effectiveness of these rituals depends on your sincere spiritual connection to the gods. If you're distracted, tired, or going through an emotional crisis, the rituals might fail and cosmic catastrophe could result. So every morning, regardless of how you're feeling personally, you have to achieve a state of perfect religious transcendence, while reciting ancient prayers in a dead language that you probably don't fully understand. After the morning cosmic maintenance ritual, you move on to temple duties. As Pharaoh, you are the high priest of every temple in Egypt. Theoretically, you're supposed to personally conduct religious ceremonies in hundreds of temples throughout the kingdom. Obviously, this is physically impossible, so most of these duties are delegated to actual priests who act as your representatives. But you're still spiritually responsible for every ritual performed in your name, and you have to personally handle the most important ceremonies. This means that several times per week, you have to travel to various temples and perform elaborate religious ceremonies that can last for hours. These aren't just symbolic appearances, they're complex, magical rituals where you're expected to channel divine power and communicate directly with gods. And here's the really disturbing part. These ceremonies often involve activities that would be considered deeply weird or disturbing by modern standards. For example, one of your regular duties is the feeding of the gods ceremony, where you have to offer food to divine statues and then consume portions of that food to demonstrate your connection to the divine realm. But this isn't just sharing a symbolic meal. According to Egyptian belief, the statues are literally inhabited by gods who actually consume the spiritual essence of the food you offer. Your job is to facilitate this feeding process and then eat the physical remainder to complete the spiritual transaction. Think about the psychology of this. You're having regular dinner dates with statues, while believing that invisible divine beings are actually present and participating in the meal. And you can't just pretend to believe this for political reasons. The effectiveness of these rituals supposedly depends on your genuine faith and spiritual connection. So you have to actually convince yourself that you're dining with gods, or risk cosmic catastrophe through spiritual insincerity. But perhaps the most psychologically demanding religious duty is your role as divine judge of the dead. See, in Egyptian theology, when people die, their souls have to pass through various tests and trials in the afterlife. And you, as the living representative of Osiris, god of the dead, are responsible for ensuring that these afterlife processes work correctly. This doesn't just mean performing funeral ceremonies for important people. It means that you're spiritually responsible for the fate of every soul in your kingdom after they die. Every person who dies while your pharaoh becomes, in a sense, your spiritual responsibility. Their success or failure in the afterlife reflects on your performance as a divine intermediary. Think about the psychological weight of this. You're not just responsible for people's lives, you're responsible for their eternal souls. When someone dies of disease, you have to wonder whether their death reflects your failure to maintain divine protection over your kingdom. When someone dies in war, you have to consider whether their afterlife journey will be compromised by the violent circumstances of their death. And when someone dies as a result of your direct orders, executed for crimes, killed in wars you started, sacrificed in religious ceremonies, you have to believe that you're not just ending their earthly life, but potentially determining their eternal fate. The guilt and psychological pressure of this level of cosmic responsibility is almost impossible to imagine. But let's talk about something even more disturbing: the human sacrifice rituals that were occasionally part of your divine duties. Now, I want to be clear that human sacrifice wasn't a regular feature of Egyptian religion like it was in some other ancient cultures. But it did happen, particularly during major religious festivals or in times of extreme crisis. And when it happened, you weren't just authorizing it, you were personally conducting religious ceremonies that involved killing people to appease the gods. Imagine the psychological impact of believing that the cosmic order requires you to periodically murder innocent people, and that refusing to do so might result in divine punishment for your entire kingdom. You're not killing people because you're evil or sadistic. You're killing them because you genuinely believe that their deaths are necessary to maintain reality itself. The psychological compartmentalization required to perform human sacrifice, while maintaining your sense of moral identity, is staggering. You have to simultaneously believe that murder is wrong for normal people and that murder is your divine duty as Pharaoh. And you have to perform these killings in elaborate religious ceremonies, designed to honor the victims and ensure their successful transition to the afterlife. So you're not just murdering people, you're performing sacred rituals designed to benefit the very people you're killing. Talk about psychological cognitive dissonance. But even when human sacrifice wasn't involved, your regular religious duties required you to engage in activities that would be considered deeply psychologically disturbing by modern standards. For example, many Egyptian religious ceremonies involved ritualistic consumption of substances that had symbolic connections to blood, death, or bodily fluids. Wine that was explicitly described as divine blood, bread that represented divine flesh, various preparations that were symbolically associated with decay, transformation, and rebirth. You had to consume these substances while genuinely believing in their religious significance and maintaining perfect spiritual focus. You couldn't just think of it as symbolic theater. You had to actually experience it as a form of divine communion. And some of these substances had psychoactive properties that could cause hallucinations, altered states of consciousness, or other psychological effects. Part of your job as Pharaoh was to regularly consume mind-altering substances in religious contexts, and then interpret your resulting experiences as divine communications. Think about that for a second. Your job description literally included getting high and having hallucinations, then making important governmental decisions based on what you experienced while under the influence. And you couldn't question whether these drug-induced visions were actually divine communications or just the predictable result of consuming psychoactive substances. Questioning the authenticity of religious experiences would undermine your entire authority as Pharaoh. So you had to believe, or at least convince yourself that you believed, that your drug-induced hallucinations were genuine, divine revelations that should guide your decision-making as a political leader. The potential for psychological damage from this kind of systematic reality distortion is enormous. But perhaps the most psychologically disturbing aspect of your divine duties was the complete absence of any relief or escape from cosmic responsibility. Normal religious people can have crises of faith, periods of doubt, or times when they question their beliefs without facing immediate catastrophic consequences. You couldn't afford to have spiritual crises because the entire kingdom's welfare supposedly depended on your unwavering faith and divine connection. If you started questioning whether the gods actually existed, whether your rituals were effective, or whether your divine status was real, you couldn't just work through these doubts privately like a normal person might. Your spiritual crisis would immediately become a political crisis, because your authority as Pharaoh was based entirely on your supposed divine connection. So you had to suppress any religious doubts, ignore any evidence that contradicted your divine status, and maintain perfect faith even when your personal experiences suggested that the whole system might be elaborate mythology. And here's what makes this even more psychologically twisted. You probably did have experiences that seemed to confirm your divine status, but they were likely the result of psychological manipulation rather than actual divine intervention. Think about it. You're surrounded by priests who have dedicated their lives to making you believe in your own divinity. They're experts at creating religious experiences that feel authentic and meaningful. They know exactly which substances to give you to induce specific types of hallucinations. They understand how to use architecture, lighting, music, and theatrical effects to create transcendent spiritual experiences. They're trained in psychological techniques that can make normal coincidences feel like divine miracles. So you probably did have regular experiences that felt like genuine divine communication. But these experiences were likely created by very human religious professionals who needed you to believe in your own godhood for their own power and security. You were essentially the victim of the most sophisticated religious manipulation campaign in human history, conducted by people who may have genuinely believed they were serving the gods by deceiving you. The psychological impact of this kind of systematic manipulation is devastating. You lose the ability to distinguish between authentic spiritual experiences and manufactured religious theater. You can't trust your own perceptions because they've been systematically altered by people with ulterior motives. But you also can't question these experiences without undermining the entire foundation of your identity and authority. So you become trapped in a religious reality that may be entirely artificial, but which you can't escape without losing everything that gives your life meaning and purpose. And this brings us to one of the most disturbing aspects of pharaonic religious life: the gradual erosion of your ability to think critically about spiritual matters. Normal religious development involves questioning, doubting, and eventually arriving at beliefs that feel personally authentic and meaningful. Your religious development involved systematic indoctrination, designed to eliminate questioning and doubt in favor of unthinking acceptance of whatever your priests told you. You weren't encouraged to develop your own spiritual understanding or personal relationship with the divine. You were trained to accept a pre-existing religious framework that served political purposes more than spiritual ones. And over time, this systematic suppression of critical thinking about religious matters spreads to other areas of your mental life. If you can't question religious authority, it becomes harder to question political authority. If you can't doubt spiritual claims, it becomes difficult to evaluate practical claims. If you can't think critically about divine matters, your overall capacity for rational analysis becomes compromised. Many pharaohs seem to have developed what modern psychologists would recognize as a form of learned helplessness when it came to independent thinking. They became so dependent on religious authorities for spiritual guidance that they lost the ability to make autonomous decisions about anything that had religious implications. And since everything in ancient Egypt had religious implications, this meant they lost the ability to think independently about most important matters. This created pharaohs who were simultaneously the most powerful people in the world and completely dependent on religious advisors, who may have been manipulating them for personal or institutional gain. But let's talk about something even more psychologically disturbing. What happened when your divine duties required you to participate in ceremonies that involved the sexual or romantic lives of your subjects? See, fertility was considered a divine responsibility in ancient Egypt. The pharaoh's cosmic duties included ensuring that crops grew, animals reproduced, and humans had children successfully. This wasn't just a general responsibility. It involved specific religious ceremonies where you had to bless marriages, consecrate sexual unions, and perform rituals designed to enhance fertility for specific individuals. Think about the psychological weirdness of having your job description include managing other people's sex lives through religious intervention. You had to perform ceremonies where you blessed newlywed sexual compatibility. You conducted rituals designed to help infertile couples conceive children. You participated in religious festivals that explicitly celebrated human sexuality and reproduction. And these weren't just symbolic blessings. According to Egyptian belief, your divine intervention could actually affect people's sexual and reproductive success. So when couples failed to have children after you had blessed their union, that failure reflected on your divine effectiveness. When marriages ended in divorce or dysfunction, that suggested your blessing hadn't been spiritually powerful enough. You became personally invested in the intimate lives of your subjects in ways that would be considered deeply inappropriate by modern standards. But perhaps most disturbingly, some Egyptian religious traditions required the pharaoh to participate in sexual rituals designed to ensure cosmic fertility. I'm not going to go into graphic detail here, but historical records suggest that some pharaohs were expected to perform sexual acts in religious contexts, either with temple prostitutes or with their own spouses in public ceremonies, to demonstrate and enhance the kingdom's fertility. Imagine the psychological impact of having your most intimate moments turned into public religious performances that are supposed to have cosmic significance. Your sexuality isn't private or personal. It's a divine responsibility that affects the welfare of millions of people. And if you're not comfortable with public sexual performance, if you have difficulty maintaining arousal under pressure, or if you're just not interested in sex for religious purposes, that becomes a theological crisis rather than a personal preference. Your sexual dysfunction isn't just embarrassing, it's potentially evidence that you've lost your divine connection and are no longer qualified to be Pharaoh. The psychological pressure of having to perform sexually in religious contexts while maintaining divine dignity and cosmic effectiveness is almost impossible to imagine. But let's move on to something that might be even more psychologically damaging: your relationship with prophecy and divine prediction. As Pharaoh, you weren't just responsible for understanding the present situation in your kingdom. You were also expected to receive divine visions about the future and make political decisions based on prophetic information. This meant that you had to regularly claim to have supernatural knowledge about future events, and then deal with the consequences when your predictions inevitably turned out to be wrong. Think about the psychological burden of having to pretend you can see the future while knowing that you actually can't. You make predictions about military conflicts, natural disasters, economic conditions, and political developments. Some of these predictions turn out to be accurate through luck or good strategic analysis. Others turn out to be completely wrong. When your predictions are accurate, everyone celebrates your divine wisdom and prophetic abilities. When your predictions are wrong, you have to find ways to explain why the gods apparently gave you false information. Maybe the divine message was symbolic rather than literal. Maybe your spiritual connection was temporarily compromised by personal failings. Maybe the gods were testing your faith by giving you misleading visions. You develop elaborate theological explanations for why divine prophecy sometimes fails, all while maintaining the claim that you receive genuine divine communications. The mental gymnastics required to maintain belief in your own prophetic abilities while repeatedly experiencing prophetic failures is psychologically exhausting. And you can't just stop making predictions because prophecy is part of your job description as Pharaoh. Your subjects expect divine guidance about the future, and failing to provide it would undermine your authority. So you're trapped in a cycle of making predictions you know you can't fulfill, then creating theological excuses when those predictions fail, while continuing to claim divine prophetic abilities. This kind of systematic self-deception and reality distortion is a recipe for serious psychological problems. But perhaps the most psychologically disturbing aspect of your divine duties is how they gradually disconnect you from normal human empathy and moral reasoning. Normal people develop their moral sense through interaction with others, experience of consequences, and gradual understanding of how their actions affect other people's well-being. Your moral development is shaped entirely by religious doctrines that may have little connection to normal human welfare. If the gods demand human sacrifice, then killing innocent people becomes morally correct. If divine law requires harsh punishment for minor offenses, then extreme cruelty becomes righteous justice. If cosmic order requires maintaining social inequality, then oppressing the poor becomes a religious duty. Your moral compass becomes calibrated to divine commands rather than human welfare. And these two standards often conflict dramatically. This creates pharaohs who can genuinely believe they're acting morally while doing things that normal people would recognize as monstrous. They're not evil in the traditional sense. They're people whose moral reasoning has been systematically warped by religious indoctrination that prioritizes cosmic concerns over human concerns. And the truly disturbing part is that this moral warping happens gradually, through thousands of small religious duties that slowly train you to value divine approval over human well-being. You start by accepting that some human suffering is necessary to maintain cosmic order. Then you learn to ignore individual pain in favor of cosmic benefits. Eventually, you become capable of causing enormous human suffering while genuinely believing that you're serving a higher moral purpose. The psychological transformation from normal human empathy to cosmic moral indifference is one of the most disturbing aspects of the entire pharaonic system. And this brings us to something that ties together all the psychological horrors we've discussed: the complete impossibility of personal growth or authentic self-development when your entire identity is defined by an external, religious, and political role. Normal human development involves exploration, experimentation, making mistakes, learning from failure, and gradually discovering who you are as an individual separate from your social roles. You get none of that. Your identity is fixed from the moment you become Pharaoh. You are a god. You are perfect. You are infallible. You don't need to grow or change or learn because you're already the ultimate expression of divine wisdom. But of course, you're not actually perfect or infallible. You're a human being with the same needs for growth, connection, and authentic self-expression as everyone else. So you're trapped in an identity that prevents the very psychological development that would make you capable of fulfilling that identity effectively. You can't learn from mistakes because gods don't make mistakes. You can't seek help or advice because gods don't need assistance. You can't change your approach or try new strategies because divine wisdom is eternal and unchanging. The psychological frustration of being prevented from growing into the role you're required to perform is enormous. And this static identity trap becomes more psychologically damaging the longer you remain Pharaoh. Every year that passes without genuine personal development makes you less capable of handling the psychological pressures of absolute power and cosmic responsibility. But you can't acknowledge this declining capacity or seek help in developing better coping strategies, because that would undermine the divine perfection that justifies your authority. So you gradually become less psychologically capable of handling your responsibilities, while being required to maintain the appearance of increasing divine wisdom and effectiveness. It's a recipe for complete psychological breakdown, which helps explain why so many pharaohs seem to have become increasingly paranoid, erratic, and detached from reality over the course of their reigns. But we're not done exploring the psychological nightmare of pharaonic life, because we haven't even talked about what happens when you get sick, injured, or start aging because gods don't have health problems. And admitting physical vulnerability could trigger political collapse and religious crises. Alright, let's talk about something that's going to make you grateful for modern healthcare. What happens when you're literally worshipped as a perfect divine being, but your very human body starts falling apart in very ungodly ways? Here's the fundamental problem. Gods don't get sick. Gods don't age. Gods don't have physical limitations or health problems, but you're stuck in a human body that absolutely will get sick, age, and develop all the disgusting, embarrassing, and potentially fatal health issues that human bodies are famous for, and you can't admit to any of it. Let me paint you a picture of what this looks like in practice. You wake up one morning and notice a strange rash on your arm. Normal person responds, that's weird. I should probably see a doctor. Pharaoh responds, oh God, this could be visible evidence that I'm not actually divine. If anyone sees this, it could trigger a religious crisis that destroys my authority and possibly gets me killed. I need to hide this immediately and find a way to treat it without anyone knowing I have a health problem. Every minor health issue becomes a potential political catastrophe. And we're not just talking about serious diseases here. We're talking about normal human body functions that gods supposedly don't experience. You get a pimple. That's evidence of physical imperfection that contradicts your divine nature. You have bad breath. Gods don't have digestive issues or oral hygiene problems. You get a cold and start sneezing during a religious ceremony. Clearly, you've lost your divine protection against mortal illnesses. Your body becomes an enemy that's constantly threatening to expose your humanity and undermine your godhood. But let's talk about what ancient Egyptian healthcare was actually like. Because trying to get medical treatment when you're supposedly perfect creates some truly bizarre situations. First, you can't just visit a doctor like a normal person. Doctors are for mortals who have health problems. Gods don't need medical assistance because gods don't get sick. So instead, you have to work through an elaborate system of palace physicians, who are officially described as divine health advisors or keepers of sacred vitality, rather than actual doctors. And these aren't just physicians who happen to work for the royal family. These are specially trained medical professionals who understand that their job isn't just treating your health problems, it's maintaining the illusion that you don't have health problems, while secretly treating the health problems you're not supposed to have. Think about how psychologically weird this must be for everyone involved. You're sitting there with obvious symptoms of some disease, and your doctor is examining you while both of you pretend that what's happening isn't actually medical treatment. Your divine magnificence, I notice that your sacred essence seems to be experiencing some minor cosmic fluctuations that might benefit from this blessed herbal preparation. Translation: you have dysentery and need to take this medicine. But the psychological mind games go deeper than just euphemistic language. Because your palace physicians aren't just treating your medical conditions, they're managing theological crises. Every health problem you experience raises uncomfortable questions about your divine nature. If you're really a god, why are you getting sick? If you have genuine divine protection, why isn't it preventing human ailments? Your doctors have to develop elaborate theological explanations for why gods can experience health problems that appear identical to human health problems, but are actually completely different divine phenomena. Maybe your illness isn't really an illness, it's a divine test that's strengthening your cosmic powers. Maybe your physical symptoms aren't actually physical, they're manifestations of spiritual battles you're fighting in higher dimensional realms. Maybe your health problems aren't problems at all, they're sacred purification processes that are enhancing your godhood. Your medical care becomes a combination of actual healthcare and religious apologetics designed to explain why divine beings can appear to have very ungodly health issues. And here's the really disturbing part. Everyone involved has to believe these explanations, or at least pretend to believe them. Because acknowledging that you have normal human health problems would undermine the entire theological foundation of your authority. So you're getting medical treatment for real diseases while everyone involved pretends that what's happening is actually cosmic, spiritual phenomena rather than mundane human illness. The psychological disconnection from reality required to maintain this kind of systematic medical denial is staggering. But let's talk about some specific health issues that were particularly problematic for pharaohs. Because ancient Egyptian medical records give us some disturbing insights into what divine healthcare actually looked like. Dental problems were extremely common in ancient Egypt because the diet was full of sand, grit, and substances that were terrible for tooth enamel. By Middle Age, most Egyptians had seriously damaged teeth, missing teeth, and related infections. But gods don't have dental problems. Gods have perfect divine teeth that aren't affected by mortal concerns like decay, infection, or structural damage. So when your teeth inevitably started rotting, and they absolutely would, because even divine beings have to eat the same gritty, ancient Egyptian food as everyone else, you couldn't just go to a dentist and get them fixed. Instead, you had to work with specialized palace dental advisors who performed elaborate procedures disguised as religious purification rituals. Tooth extractions became ceremonies for removing divine impurities that were blocking cosmic energy flow. Dental infections were treated as spiritual purification processes that were enhancing sacred tooth essence. Missing teeth were replaced with gold and gemstone prosthetics that were described as divine enhancement upgrades rather than medical necessities. Archaeological evidence from pharaonic mummies shows some of the most sophisticated dental work in the ancient world. Complex gold, bridgework, gemstone inlays, elaborate prosthetic devices, all designed to maintain the appearance of divine dental perfection while treating very human dental disasters. But here's the psychologically disturbing part. All of this dental work had to be done without modern anesthesia. And you couldn't show any signs of pain or discomfort during the procedures. Gods don't feel pain. Gods certainly don't cry or scream during dental surgery. So you had to endure hours of primitive dental procedures while maintaining perfect divine composure and pretending that what was happening was spiritually pleasant rather than physically agonizing. Imagine getting a tooth extracted with ancient tools, while having to smile and act like you're enjoying a religious experience. And dental problems were just the beginning. Let's talk about digestive issues, which were extremely common in ancient Egypt due to poor food preservation, contaminated water, and diets that were nutritionally problematic. Gods don't have stomach problems. Gods don't get food poisoning. Gods certainly don't have embarrassing digestive symptoms that normal humans experience. But you absolutely will have digestive problems, because ancient Egyptian food safety was basically non-existent. And even the best palace cuisine was prepared under conditions that would horrify modern health inspectors. So, when you inevitably get severe diarrhea, stomach cramps, nausea, or other gastrointestinal symptoms, you have to hide them while continuing to perform your public duties as Pharaoh. You can't excuse yourself from important ceremonies because you're having digestive emergencies. You can't postpone state meetings because you're too nauseous to concentrate. You can't ask for privacy to deal with embarrassing bathroom situations. Instead, you have to maintain perfect divine composure while your digestive system stages a full rebellion. Palace records show that pharaohs developed elaborate protocols for managing digestive emergencies during public appearances. Special signal systems to communicate bathroom needs to attendants. Carefully planned ceremony schedules that included strategic breaks for divine meditation periods. Specially designed royal garments that could conceal evidence of digestive accidents. Think about the psychological stress of having to manage severe gastrointestinal distress while conducting important governmental business and maintaining the appearance of divine perfection. You're trying to make life or death political decisions while your stomach is cramping so badly you can barely concentrate. You're conducting religious ceremonies while fighting nausea and trying not to vomit on sacred objects. You're meeting with foreign ambassadors while desperately needing to find a bathroom, but being unable to excuse yourself without compromising your divine dignity. The physical discomfort is bad enough, but the psychological pressure of having to hide normal human biological responses while performing complex leadership duties is almost impossible to imagine. And this is just routine digestive problems. Let's talk about what happened when pharaohs developed serious chronic illnesses that couldn't be hidden or quickly treated. Historical analysis of pharaonic mummies shows evidence of various chronic conditions: arthritis, heart disease, diabetes, kidney problems, respiratory disorders, and other ailments that would have caused ongoing pain and disability. But gods don't have chronic illnesses. Gods don't experience ongoing pain or physical limitation. Gods certainly don't gradually decline in health and capability over time. So pharaohs with serious chronic conditions had to maintain their full range of royal duties while secretly managing debilitating health problems that they couldn't acknowledge or treat openly. Imagine trying to run an empire while dealing with untreated diabetes. Picture conducting military campaigns while suffering from severe arthritis that makes movement painful. Think about performing elaborate religious ceremonies while experiencing chronic respiratory problems that make breathing difficult. And you can't adjust your duties, delegate responsibilities, or modify your activities to accommodate your health limitations, because doing so would suggest that you have health limitations, which gods don't have. So you have to maintain the same level of physical and mental performance. while secretly dealing with medical conditions that would seriously compromise anyone's ability to function effectively. The psychological toll of this kind of performance under physical distress is enormous. Chronic pain and illness naturally lead to fatigue, irritability, difficulty concentrating, and reduced tolerance for stress. But you can't acknowledge these psychological impacts or seek accommodation for them, because they're caused by physical health problems that you're not supposed to have. So you develop secondary psychological problems as a result of untreated physical problems. But you can't treat either the physical or psychological issues without admitting that gods can experience mortal limitations. This creates a cycle of deteriorating health that becomes progressively more difficult to hide and manage, but which you're increasingly incapable of addressing effectively. And it gets worse when we talk about mental health issues, because gods definitely don't have psychological problems. The isolation, paranoia, constant performance pressure, and systematic reality distortion that we've discussed in previous chapters would absolutely cause serious mental health problems in any normal person. Depression, anxiety, paranoid personality traits, dissociative episodes, substance abuse issues, eating disorders, all predictable psychological responses to the impossible pressures of pharaonic life. But you can't acknowledge having mental health problems, because that would suggest that your divine mind is imperfect, or that cosmic responsibilities are too much for your godly consciousness to handle. So you have to hide depression while making important political decisions that affect millions of people. You have to conceal anxiety while conducting religious ceremonies that supposedly require perfect spiritual focus. You have to manage paranoid thoughts while maintaining trusting relationships with advisors and family members. And you can't seek psychological treatment or support because admitting that you need mental health assistance would undermine your entire authority as Pharaoh. The psychological isolation becomes even more complete when you're struggling with mental health issues that you can't acknowledge or address. But perhaps the most psychologically disturbing aspect of divine health management is what happened when pharaohs started showing signs of aging. Gods don't age. Gods don't develop wrinkles, gray hair, reduced physical strength, memory problems, or any of the other normal changes that happen to human bodies over time. But you absolutely will age, because you're human, and human bodies inevitably show signs of time passing. So, as you get older, every visible sign of aging becomes evidence that contradicts your divine nature. Your first gray hair isn't just a normal part of getting older. It's proof that you're mortal rather than divine. Wrinkles around your eyes aren't just natural skin changes. They're visible evidence that time affects you like any other human being. This creates an escalating battle against normal aging processes that becomes more psychologically demanding and less sustainable over time. Palace records show that older pharaohs employed teams of cosmetic specialists whose job was to maintain the illusion of eternal youth through increasingly elaborate techniques. Hair dyes made from exotic ingredients, cosmetic procedures designed to reduce wrinkles and age spots, physical training programs intended to maintain strength and mobility, dietary regimens supposed to slow aging processes. But these anti-aging efforts had to be disguised as divine enhancement rituals rather than acknowledged as medical treatments for aging. Your hair isn't being dyed to hide grey. It's being blessed with divine color restoration. Your wrinkles aren't being treated with cosmetic procedures. You're receiving sacred rejuvenation, ceremonies that enhance your cosmic radiance. The psychological energy required to maintain these elaborate self-deceptions while dealing with the normal emotional challenges of aging is exhausting, and it becomes progressively more difficult As you get older, and the gap between your actual physical condition and your supposed divine perfection becomes increasingly obvious. Eventually, many pharaohs reached a point where maintaining the illusion of divine health required so much time, energy, and resources that it seriously compromised their ability to actually govern effectively. They spent more time on health-related deception than on administrative duties. They made political decisions based on what would best conceal their health problems rather than what would best serve the kingdom. They avoided public appearances and activities that might expose their physical limitations. The irony is devastating. The effort required to maintain the appearance of divine fitness actually made them less fit to perform their divine duties. But the most psychologically damaging aspect of this entire health deception system is how it gradually eroded their ability to understand their own physical and mental condition. Normal people develop self-awareness about their health through honest assessment of symptoms, open communication with healthcare providers, and realistic planning for managing health issues. You got none of that. Instead, you learned to ignore symptoms, dismiss health concerns, and maintain unrealistic expectations about your physical and mental capabilities. This systematic disconnection from health reality made it much more difficult to make good decisions about medical treatment, lifestyle modifications, or realistic planning for the future. Many pharaohs seem to have died from relatively treatable conditions that became fatal because they couldn't acknowledge having health problems until those problems became too obvious to deny. They developed a form of medical denial that was so complete that they couldn't seek effective treatment even when their lives depended on it. And this brings us to perhaps the most disturbing aspect of pharaonic health management. What happened when you were obviously dying but still couldn't admit to having health problems? Okay, here's where we reach the absolute peak of psychological horror in pharaonic life. You are literally worshipped as an immortal god, but you're going to die. And everyone knows you're going to die. But nobody can acknowledge that you're going to die because that would undermine the entire religious and political system that keeps your kingdom functioning. Welcome to the most elaborate death denial system in human history. Let me start with the fundamental contradiction that defined every pharaoh's relationship with mortality. Your entire authority is based on being a divine being who transcends normal human limitations. But your most essential human limitation, death, is something that will definitely happen to you, probably sooner rather than later. Ancient Egyptian life expectancy was brutal. Even wealthy people rarely lived past 50. Even pharaohs, with access to the best food, healthcare, and living conditions available, typically died in their 30s or 40s. But gods don't die of old age, disease, or injury. Gods either live forever or transition to higher forms of divine existence through cosmic processes that normal humans can't understand. So from the moment you become pharaoh, you're living with the knowledge that you're going to die relatively soon. But you can't plan for your death, prepare your successors, or manage the political implications of your mortality without admitting that you're not actually immortal. Think about the psychological burden of this. Normal people can make end-of-life plans, discuss their mortality with family members, and gradually prepare for the fact that their time is limited. You have to pretend that death is something that happens to other people while secretly knowing that you're probably going to die within the next decade or two. And you can't just ignore this reality, because managing your death and succession is actually one of your most important responsibilities as pharaoh. The stability of the entire kingdom depends on smooth transition of power when you die. But you can't openly plan for succession because that would require acknowledging that you're mortal, which would undermine the divine authority that makes succession possible in the first place. So you have to secretly manage succession planning while publicly maintaining the pretense that succession planning is unnecessary because you're immortal. It's like trying to plan your own funeral while pretending that you're never going to die. Let's talk about what this looks like in practice, because the psychological gymnastics involved in pharaonic death management are absolutely insane. First, you have to start planning your death from the moment you become pharaoh. Because tomb construction and mummification preparation require decades of advanced work, your tomb isn't just a grave, it's the most elaborate architectural project in your kingdom, designed to house your divine essence for eternity and provide everything you'll need in the afterlife. Thousands of workers spend years carving chambers, painting murals, installing sacred objects, and creating the most sophisticated burial complex in the ancient world. But you can't visit your tomb while it's being constructed, because that would be acknowledging that you're going to die and use it someday. So you're financing the most expensive construction project in your kingdom, managing thousands of workers and enormous resources, and making detailed decisions about architectural specifications for a building that you're not allowed to see and can't admit is for you. Think about the psychological weirdness of micromanaging your own grave while pretending that it's not your grave. And the tomb construction is just the beginning. You also have to prepare for mummification, which requires advanced planning for preserving your body according to specific religious protocols. Your internal organs need to be removed and preserved in special containers called canopic jars. Your body needs to be treated with various substances and wrapped in blessed linens. Your mummy needs to be equipped with magical amulets and objects that will protect you in the afterlife. All of this preparation requires detailed, advanced planning and coordination with specialized mortuary priests who understand the religious requirements for divine mummification. But you can't openly plan your own mummification because that would be acknowledging that your body is going to die and need preservation. So you have to secretly coordinate with mortuary specialists while maintaining the public pretense that mummification planning is unnecessary because divine bodies don't die. And here's where it gets really psychologically twisted. Part of mummification preparation involves creating detailed documentation about your life, achievements, and divine nature that will be buried with you to ensure your successful transition to the afterlife. These documents, known as books of the dead, contain specific spells, prayers, and information designed to help your soul navigate the afterlife and maintain your divine status in the realm of the dead. But creating these documents requires you to write about your own death as if it's a future event that will definitely happen, while maintaining the public position that your death is not going to happen because you're immortal. You're essentially writing your own obituary and afterlife insurance policy, while pretending that you're never going to need them. The psychological compartmentalization required to engage in detailed death planning while maintaining public immortality claims is staggering. But let's talk about succession planning, because this is where the death denial system becomes truly psychologically devastating. You need to prepare your heir to take over when you die, but you can't acknowledge that you're going to die and need a replacement. So instead, you have to frame succession planning as divine preparation for cosmic transitions or training programs for future divine manifestations. Your heir isn't being prepared to replace you when you die. They're being educated about divine responsibilities in case cosmic forces require temporary power sharing or dimensional transitions. Think about how confusing this must be for everyone involved. You're giving your heir detailed training about how to run the kingdom after you're gone, but you're both pretending that you're not going to be gone because gods don't die. Your heir has to prepare for taking over your responsibilities while maintaining the fiction that they'll never actually need to take over because you're immortal. And you have to train them for leadership while avoiding any language or behavior that suggests you expect them to lead because you'll be dead. The psychological cognitive dissonance involved in this kind of succession planning is almost impossible to imagine. But it gets worse when we consider the political implications of succession planning in a system where the pharaoh's death is supposed to be impossible. If you're really immortal, then succession planning suggests either that you're not actually immortal, which undermines your authority, or that you're planning to abandon your divine responsibilities, which also undermines your authority. Your enemies can use any evidence of succession planning as proof that you doubt your own immortality and are therefore unqualified to be pharaoh. But failing to plan for succession could lead to civil war and political collapse when you inevitably die. So you have to engage in succession planning while making it look like you're not engaging in succession planning, all while managing the political sensitivities of people who might use succession preparations as weapons against you. And your heir faces their own impossible psychological situation. They need to prepare for power while hoping they never get it, because getting it means you died, and your death would prove that gods can die, which undermines the entire system that would give them authority. They're simultaneously hoping for your death so they can become pharaoh and hoping for your immortality, to maintain the divine system that would make their rule legitimate. Talk about conflicted motivations. But perhaps the most psychologically disturbing aspect of pharaonic death management is what happened when you started showing obvious signs that you were dying. Normal people can acknowledge declining health, seek palliative care, say goodbye to loved ones, and prepare emotionally for death. You have to maintain the pretense of divine vitality while secretly knowing that your time is running out. When you develop a terminal illness, it can't be described as a terminal illness. When you start experiencing organ failure, it has to be framed as cosmic energy fluctuations. When you're obviously in the final stages of dying, everyone has to pretend that you're experiencing divine transformation processes. Imagine the psychological burden of dying while being surrounded by people who can't acknowledge that you're dying. You can't have honest conversations about your fears, regrets, or hopes for the future. You can't receive emotional support for dealing with mortality. You can't make peace with death, because everyone around you has to pretend that death isn't happening. Instead, you have to maintain divine composure while experiencing the physical pain, emotional fear, and existential uncertainty that comes with dying. And your family and advisors have to watch you die while pretending that what they're seeing isn't death, it's divine ascension or cosmic transition or some other theological process that normal humans can't understand. The psychological trauma of being unable to acknowledge or grieve someone's death while it's happening in front of you is enormous. But the really twisted part is what happened immediately after you died, because your death had to be managed as a public relations crisis rather than a normal human event. When you died, palace officials couldn't just announce that the pharaoh had died. That would raise uncomfortable questions about divine mortality and immortality claims. Instead, your death had to be framed as a voluntary divine transition, where you chose to move to a higher form of existence rather than being forced to die by mortal limitations. You didn't die of disease, injury, or old age. You ascended to the afterlife to take up your new divine responsibilities as Osiris, god of the dead. Your death became a promotion rather than an ending. But managing this theological spin required elaborate cover-up operations that had to be coordinated in advance and executed immediately after you died. Your body had to be hidden while preparations were made for public announcement of your divine ascension. Official stories had to be developed to explain why your transition happened at this particular time. Religious ceremonies had to be prepared to celebrate your elevation to higher divine status. And all of this had to happen quickly, before anyone could ask uncomfortable questions about why gods need elaborate funeral preparations if they're just transitioning to higher forms of existence. The people managing your death essentially had to stage a divine promotion ceremony while secretly handling normal human death logistics. Think about the psychological stress of trying to manage theological public relations while grieving the loss of someone who was supposedly immortal. But perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of pharaonic death management was its impact on your heir, who had to simultaneously take power and participate in the elaborate fiction that you hadn't actually died. Your successor couldn't just inherit the throne. They had to undergo a divine transformation that made them the new earthly manifestation of Horus, while you became the new manifestation of Osiris in the afterlife. But this theological explanation created impossible psychological demands for your heir. They had to grieve your death while pretending that death hadn't occurred. They had to celebrate their promotion while maintaining that it wasn't really a promotion, because divine power doesn't transfer through human death. And they had to immediately begin performing all the same psychological contortions that had made your life so psychologically devastating, including denying their own mortality while secretly planning for their own death. The cycle of death denial and succession anxiety just continued with the next pharaoh, who inherited not just political power, but also all the psychological burdens that came with maintaining impossible claims about divine immortality. Let me give you a specific example of how psychologically twisted this death management system could become. When Tutankhamun died, probably around age 18 or 19, his death had to be managed as a divine ascension rather than the tragic early death of a teenager who had never really gotten the chance to rule effectively. But Tutankhamun's divine ascension created immediate political problems because he died without a clear heir. And his divine transformation happened at an inconvenient time when Egypt was facing external threats and internal political instability. So palace officials had to simultaneously celebrate his elevation to higher divine status while secretly scrambling to manage a succession crisis that threatened the entire kingdom. They had to maintain the fiction that divine transitions are always perfectly timed cosmic events while dealing with the very human reality that people sometimes die at politically inconvenient moments. The official religious ceremonies honored Tutankhamun's successful divine ascension, while backroom political negotiations desperately tried to prevent civil war over succession. Think about the psychological compartmentalization required to participate in religious celebrations of divine promotion, while privately managing political catastrophe caused by extremely inconvenient human death. And this kind of cognitive dissonance wasn't unusual. It was the normal way that pharaonic deaths were handled throughout Egyptian history. Every pharaoh's death created the same impossible situation: public celebration of divine advancement combined with private crisis management of very human political problems. But let's talk about what happened to pharaohs who lived long enough to see their own physical and mental decline become obvious to everyone around them. Some pharaohs lived into their 50s or 60s, which was considered extremely old by ancient Egyptian standards. By that age, they were often dealing with serious health problems, cognitive decline, and obvious physical frailty. But gods don't become senile, develop dementia, or lose their physical capabilities through aging. So elderly pharaohs had to maintain the appearance of divine wisdom and capability while possibly experiencing memory problems. confusion, reduced physical strength, and other age-related changes that made effective leadership increasingly difficult. Palace officials developed elaborate systems for managing elderly pharaohs, who were no longer capable of performing their duties effectively but couldn't be replaced because gods don't retire due to incapacity. Advisors would make decisions and then present them to the pharaoh in ways that made it appear that the pharaoh had made the decisions. Court protocols were modified to reduce the physical and cognitive demands on pharaohs, who could no longer handle complex ceremonial requirements. In extreme cases, some elderly pharaohs were essentially kept as ceremonial figureheads, while real power was exercised by regents or advisors who ruled in their name. But all of this had to be done secretly, because acknowledging that a pharaoh was incapacitated would undermine the divine authority that justified their continued rule. So Egypt was sometimes effectively ruled by people who weren't officially in charge, while the actual pharaoh was maintained as a divine symbol who couldn't perform divine duties. The psychological impact on everyone involved in these arrangements was devastating. The incapacitated pharaoh had to live with the knowledge that they were no longer capable of fulfilling their cosmic responsibilities, but couldn't admit their limitations or seek appropriate care. The unofficial rulers had to make life and death decisions for the kingdom, while maintaining the fiction that they weren't actually in charge. And everyone else had to participate in an elaborate performance where obviously incapacitated leaders were treated as if they were still divinely effective. This kind of systematic reality denial creates psychological problems that extend far beyond the individuals directly involved. When everyone in a system has to ignore obvious truths and maintain impossible fictions, it undermines the entire society's relationship with reality and rational decision-making. But perhaps the most psychologically disturbing aspect of pharaonic death management was how it affected the way people throughout Egyptian society thought about death and mortality. Normal grief processes require acknowledging loss, expressing emotions about death, and gradually accepting the reality of mortality. But Egyptian society was built around the systematic denial of pharaonic mortality, which made it much more difficult for everyone to develop healthy relationships with death and grief. When the most important person in your society officially doesn't die, but obviously does die, it creates cognitive dissonance that affects how you think about your own mortality and the deaths of people you care about. If gods can die but aren't supposed to die, what does that mean for normal humans who definitely will die? If divine immortality is possible but doesn't actually prevent death, how should you think about your own death and the deaths of your loved ones? The psychological confusion created by systematic death denial at the highest levels of society rippled through Egyptian culture in ways that made death more frightening and grief more complicated for everyone. And this brings us to one of the most tragic aspects of the entire pharaonic system: how it prevented the very people who needed emotional support the most from getting any genuine human comfort. When they were facing the ultimate human experience, you lived your entire life surrounded by people who couldn't acknowledge your humanity, and you died surrounded by people who couldn't acknowledge your death. The isolation was complete even at the end. But before we finish this psychological horror story, we need to talk about one more aspect of pharaonic life that ties together everything we've discussed. What happened to the few pharaohs who tried to break free from this system and live more authentically human lives? Because some pharaohs did try to escape the psychological prison of divine performance, and the results were usually catastrophic, not just for them, but for everyone around them. Alright, we've reached the final chapter of this psychological nightmare, and I need to tell you about something that's going to break your heart: the pharaohs who tried to escape. Throughout Egyptian history, there were a few pharaohs who looked at this entire system of divine performance, cosmic responsibility, and psychological isolation and said, "You know what? This is insane. I want to try being human." And the results were absolutely devastating. Let me tell you about Akhenaten, because his story is the perfect example of what happened when a pharaoh tried to break free from the traditional system and create a more authentic way of being divine. Akhenaten came to power around 1353 BCE, and within a few years, he had completely revolutionized Egyptian religion, politics, and culture in ways that shocked everyone around him. First, he abandoned the traditional Egyptian gods and declared that there was only one god, Aten, the sun disk, who should be worshipped directly rather than through the elaborate priestly hierarchy that had controlled Egyptian religion for thousands of years. This wasn't just a religious reform. This was Akhenaten saying, "I'm tired of pretending to channel dozens of different gods through elaborate rituals that I don't understand. I want a simpler relationship with divinity that feels more authentic to me personally." But it gets more radical. Akhenaten also abandoned the traditional artistic conventions that portrayed pharaohs as perfect divine beings with idealized bodies and expressions. Instead, he commissioned art that showed him with realistic human features, a long face, prominent belly, feminine hips, and expressive emotions. He allowed artists to depict him playing with his children, showing affection to his wife, and displaying genuine human emotions. For the first time in Egyptian history, you could see a pharaoh's humanity in official royal art. And he moved the capital city from Thebes to a completely new location called Amarna, where he tried to create a society based on more direct relationships between people and their god, without the elaborate hierarchies and ritual performances that characterized traditional Egyptian culture. Akhenaten was essentially trying to escape from the psychological prison of traditional pharaonic life by creating a new model of divinity that allowed for more authentic human experience. And initially, it seemed to work. The art and literature from Amarna shows a royal family that appears genuinely happy, expressive, and emotionally connected in ways that were unprecedented in Egyptian royal imagery. But here's the tragic part. Akhenaten's attempt to humanize pharaonic life ultimately destroyed him and nearly destroyed Egypt. See, the traditional system of divine performance and cosmic responsibility wasn't just psychological torture for pharaohs, it was also the foundation of Egyptian political stability, economic organization, and social order. When Akhenaten abandoned traditional religious practices, he undermined the entire priestly class that had managed Egyptian society for centuries. When he moved the capital, he disrupted administrative systems that had kept the kingdom functioning effectively. When he focused on personal religious experience rather than cosmic governance, he neglected the practical responsibilities that kept Egypt secure and prosperous. Within a few years, Egypt was facing serious internal problems and external threats that Akhenaten seemed unable or unwilling to address effectively. The priests were furious about losing their power and status. The military was concerned about weakened border defenses. The nobility was upset about disrupted trade relationships and political alliances. And ordinary Egyptians were confused and frightened by the sudden changes to religious practices that had provided stability and meaning in their lives for generations. Akhenaten's attempt to create a more authentic and humane form of divine leadership ended up creating political chaos that threatened the survival of the entire kingdom. After his death, Egyptian society systematically destroyed almost every trace of his reforms. His capital city was abandoned. His religious innovations were reversed. His artistic legacy was defaced. Even his name was chiseled off monuments and removed from official records. It was as if Egyptian culture tried to erase the memory of the pharaoh who had tried to be more human. The message was clear. Pharaohs who try to escape the traditional system of divine performance don't just fail, they become cautionary tales about what happens when gods refuse to act like gods. But Akhenaten wasn't the only pharaoh who tried to break free from the psychological constraints of traditional divine leadership. Throughout Egyptian history, there were others who attempted various forms of rebellion against the system. Some tried to delegate more authority to advisors and spend less time on ceremonial duties. Others attempted to form genuine friendships with courtiers or develop authentic romantic relationships with their spouses. A few tried to pursue personal interests and hobbies that had nothing to do with their divine responsibilities. And almost all of them faced similar consequences: political instability, religious opposition, and eventual failure that often resulted in their deaths or removal from power. The system was designed to prevent pharaohs from being authentically human, and it was very effective at punishing those who tried. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of these failed escape attempts was how they affected the pharaohs who came after the rebels. Future pharaohs learned from these examples that trying to be human was not just personally dangerous, it was a betrayal of cosmic responsibility that could destroy the entire kingdom. So, instead of inspiring more humane approaches to divine leadership, failed rebellions actually reinforced the psychological prison by demonstrating the catastrophic consequences of trying to escape. Each failed attempt to humanize pharaonic life made future pharaohs more committed to maintaining the traditional system of divine performance, no matter how psychologically damaging it might be. The system became more rigid and psychologically oppressive over time, not less. And this brings us to another tragic pattern in pharaonic history: the pharaohs who didn't try to escape the system, but who were psychologically destroyed by it anyway. Because even pharaohs who fully committed to traditional divine performance often experienced complete psychological breakdown after years or decades of maintaining impossible standards of cosmic perfection. Some became increasingly paranoid and isolated, trusting no one and seeing threats everywhere. Others developed what we would now recognize as severe depression, losing interest in governance and withdrawing from public life. A few became sadistic tyrants who took pleasure in exercising absolute power over others as a way of coping with their own powerlessness within the divine system. And some simply went completely insane. Historical records describe pharaohs who became convinced that they were receiving divine messages that contradicted obvious reality. Others who developed elaborate conspiracy theories about supernatural enemies. Some who lost the ability to distinguish between religious performance and authentic spiritual experience. The psychological pressure of maintaining divine perfection while dealing with very human limitations and emotions eventually broke many pharaohs in spectacular and disturbing ways. But here's what makes this even more tragic. When pharaohs experienced psychological breakdown, the system interpreted their mental health problems as evidence of their spiritual greatness rather than their human vulnerability. Paranoid delusions were described as divine visions. Manic episodes were celebrated as periods of enhanced cosmic connection. Severe depression was interpreted as deep spiritual contemplation of cosmic mysteries. The system that had caused their psychological problems then used those same problems as proof of their divine nature. So pharaohs, who were obviously suffering from serious mental health issues, couldn't get appropriate treatment or support, because their symptoms were being celebrated as evidence of their godhood. They were trapped in psychological illness that was systematically misunderstood and reinforced by everyone around them. And this pattern continued throughout Egyptian history. Pharaohs who tried to be human were punished. Pharaohs who tried to be perfectly divine went insane. And pharaohs who went insane were celebrated as especially spiritual. There was literally no psychologically healthy way to be pharaoh. But let me tell you about one more aspect of this system that's particularly heartbreaking. What happened to the children who grew up watching their parents destroy themselves, trying to be gods? Royal children saw their fathers and mothers sacrifice their humanity, their relationships, their mental health, and ultimately their lives to maintain divine performance. They watched their parents become increasingly isolated, paranoid, and emotionally unavailable. They witnessed the psychological breakdown that came from years of impossible pressure and systematic reality denial. And then they inherited the same system and were expected to do exactly the same thing to themselves. Generation after generation of royal families passed down psychological trauma disguised as divine privilege. The children who should have been protected from the worst aspects of the system instead became its next victims. Continuing cycles of isolation, performance anxiety, and mental health problems that stretched across centuries. And perhaps, most tragically, many of these royal children genuinely loved their parents and wanted to honor their memory by becoming successful pharaohs themselves. So they willingly entered the same psychological prison that had destroyed their parents, thinking they were honoring their family legacy rather than perpetuating a system of systematic psychological abuse. The love between pharaonic family members became a mechanism for transmitting trauma from one generation to the next. But before we end this psychological horror story, I want to tell you about one more thing. The occasional moments of genuine human connection that managed to break through the system despite all its psychological barriers. Because even in this environment of systematic dehumanization, there were sometimes brief instances where pharaohs experienced authentic relationships and genuine emotions. A few pharaohs did develop real friendships with advisors who managed to see past their divine performance to their human vulnerability. Some found genuine love with spouses who could offer emotional support despite the political complications. Others discovered sincere spiritual experiences that transcended the elaborate religious theater they were required to perform. These moments of authentic humanity were rare and usually brief, but they were incredibly precious to the pharaohs who experienced them. And in many cases, these brief glimpses of genuine human connection were what kept pharaohs psychologically functional for as long as they managed to survive the system. The tragic irony is that the very relationships and experiences that made pharaonic life bearable were also the ones that the system was designed to prevent and destroy. So we end where we began, with the fundamental contradiction of being human while being worshipped as a god. The pharaohs who tried to escape this contradiction were destroyed by the attempt. The pharaohs who embraced the contradiction were destroyed by the performance. And the pharaohs who tried to find middle ground were destroyed by the impossibility of being partially divine. There was no psychological solution to the problem of being pharaoh, because the problem wasn't individual weakness or personal failure. It was the inherent impossibility of the entire system. And yet this system continued for over 3,000 years. Creating hundreds of pharaohs who sacrificed their humanity for divine authority, and thousands of supporting cast members who participated in maintaining impossible fictions about godhood and immortality. It was perhaps the most successful and longest-lasting system of systematic psychological abuse in human history. And the most disturbing part, it worked. Ancient Egypt was one of the most stable, prosperous, and influential civilizations in human history, largely because this system of divine performance provided the psychological and religious foundation for effective governance. The human cost was enormous, but the social benefits were undeniable. Which brings us to the ultimate question: was it worth it? So here we are, at the end of this psychological journey through ancient Egypt. And I need to ask you something. After everything we've discussed, would you want to be Pharaoh? Think about what that life actually entailed. Complete isolation from genuine human connection. Constant performance pressure with life or death consequences. Systematic reality denial about your own mortality and limitations. Family relationships based on fear and political calculation rather than love and trust. Health problems that couldn't be acknowledged or properly treated. Religious responsibilities that required you to maintain beliefs about your own divinity that you probably knew were false. And all of this while making decisions that affected millions of people's lives. Managing an empire that spanned continents, and carrying the psychological burden of cosmic responsibility for maintaining the fundamental order of reality. The power was absolute. The wealth was unimaginable. The luxury was unprecedented. But the human cost was complete psychological destruction disguised as divine privilege. And here's what I find most disturbing about this entire system. It wasn't created by evil people who wanted to torture pharaohs for fun. It was created by intelligent, well-meaning individuals who genuinely believed that this level of systematic dehumanization was necessary to maintain social order and political stability. The priests who designed the religious protocols weren't trying to drive pharaohs insane. They were trying to create effective intermediaries between human and divine realms. The advisors who enforced social isolation weren't trying to prevent authentic relationships. They were trying to protect pharaohs from manipulation and exploitation. The courtiers who participated in elaborate performance rituals weren't trying to create psychological pressure. They were trying to demonstrate proper respect for divine authority. Everyone involved in the system had rational justifications for their participation, but the cumulative effect was the systematic, psychological destruction of the very people the system was supposed to serve and protect. It's a perfect example of how well-intentioned institutional practices can create human disasters, when they're not evaluated from the perspective of individual psychological well-being. And this pattern isn't unique to ancient Egypt. Throughout human history, we've created systems that sacrifice individual humanity for institutional effectiveness. Modern examples might include the psychological pressure on celebrities and public figures who can't have private moments or authentic emotions. The isolation experienced by extremely wealthy individuals who can't form genuine relationships because everyone wants something from them. The performance anxiety of political leaders who have to maintain public personas that prevent authentic self-expression. The specific details are different, but the fundamental dynamic is the same. When we elevate people to positions where they're expected to be more than human, we often create conditions that make them less than human. The pharaohs were the ultimate example of this pattern. They were given godlike power and authority, but at the cost of their basic humanity. And the truly tragic part is that many of them probably would have been more effective leaders if they had been allowed to be more authentically human. The psychological health and emotional intelligence that comes from genuine relationships, honest self-assessment, and realistic understanding of personal limitations often makes people better decision makers, not worse ones. But the system was designed around the assumption that divine authority required divine perfection, which prevented the very human development that might have made pharaohs more capable of handling divine responsibilities. So we're left with this heartbreaking historical irony. The people who were given the most power to help others were systematically prevented from developing the psychological resources that would have made them most capable of using that power wisely. But there's one more thing I want you to think about as we finish this journey through ancient Egyptian psychological horror. The pharaohs we've been discussing weren't abstract historical figures. They were real people with the same basic human needs for connection, authenticity, and psychological well-being that you have. They felt fear, loneliness, confusion, and pain just like you do. They wanted to be loved and understood just like you do. They struggled with impossible expectations and overwhelming responsibilities just like many of you do. The difference is that their struggles were amplified to cosmic proportions and then systematically ignored or denied by everyone around them. So when we look back at ancient Egyptian history, we shouldn't just see the monuments and artifacts and political achievements. We should also see the human cost. Thousands of individuals who sacrificed their psychological well-being for the social systems that created one of humanity's greatest civilizations. Their suffering wasn't meaningless. It contributed to developments in art, architecture, literature, medicine, and governance that influenced human culture for millennia. But it was still suffering, and it's worth acknowledging that cost as part of the full story of ancient Egyptian achievement. And maybe, if we're honest about the psychological price that people paid for ancient Egyptian greatness, we can be more thoughtful about the human costs of our own social systems and institutional practices. Because the fundamental question that ancient Egypt raises is still relevant today. How much individual humanity are we willing to sacrifice for collective achievement? And are there ways to build effective social systems that don't require the systematic psychological destruction of the people who operate them? I don't have easy answers to these questions, but I think they're worth asking, especially when we consider how many people in our own time are struggling with isolation, performance pressure, and systematic disconnection from authentic human experience. The pharaohs were extreme examples, but they weren't unique examples. And their story is ultimately a reminder that power, wealth, and status can't compensate for the loss of basic human connection and psychological well-being. The most successful civilization in ancient history was built on the systematic, psychological destruction of its leaders. Think about what that says about our assumptions about success, power, and human achievement. And think about what lessons we might learn from their experience as we build our own social systems and make our own choices about what we're willing to sacrifice for success. Because, in the end, the Pharaoh story isn't just ancient history. It's a cautionary tale about what happens when we forget that even gods need to be human. So that's our journey through the disturbing psychological reality of pharaonic life. I hope this has given you a new perspective on ancient Egyptian history and maybe some food for thought about power, isolation, and human psychological needs. Let me know in the comments what you found most disturbing about this story. Did any of these psychological dynamics remind you of modern situations? What do you think we can learn from the Pharaoh's experience? And if you enjoyed this deep dive into historical psychology, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more content exploring the hidden human costs of historical achievements. Until next time, remember, the next time someone offers you absolute power, maybe ask about the psychological support services first. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.